Throughout human history, people have simply vanished without a trace, not in wars or natural disasters, but in the most ordinary moments of their lives. A college student goes for an afternoon hike. A group of friends drives home from a basketball game. An experienced pilot takes off on a routine flight. A family sets sail on a familiar route. And then, nothing. These aren't just modern mysteries. From ancient Roman legions that marched into the wilderness and never returned, to medieval colonies that disappeared from entire islands, to present-day aircraft that vanish from radar screens, the phenomenon of unexplained disappearances has haunted humanity across every era of recorded history. The families left behind don't just lose their loved ones, they lose their peace of mind. Without bodies to bury or clear explanations for what happened, they're trapped in a kind of eternal waiting. Some spend decades searching, following every lead and investigating every theory, hoping that someday they'll finally understand what happened to the people they lost. The Flannan Isles lighthouse keepers, 21 miles off the coast of Scotland's Outer Hebrides, a group of 7 uninhabited islands rises from the North Atlantic Ocean. The Flannan Isles, named after St. Flannan, a 6th century Irish bishop who built a chapel on the largest island, had always been considered a place of mystery and superstition by local fishermen. For centuries, shepherds would bring their sheep to graze on the islands during the day, but refused to stay overnight, believing the islands were haunted by ancient spirits. In December 1900, 3 experienced lighthouse keepers were about to become part of the island's dark legend. Their disappearance would create one of Scotland's most enduring mysteries, a puzzle that has never been solved despite more than 120 years of investigation and speculation. The lighthouse on Elian Moor, the largest of the Flannan Isles, was relatively new. It had been built in 1899 by the Northern Lighthouse Board, designed by David Allen Stevenson, and stood 75 feet tall on cliffs that rose 150 feet above the churning Atlantic waters. The lighthouse was considered one of the most remote and challenging postings in the British Isles. Only the most experienced keepers were assigned to work there, men who had proven themselves capable of handling the isolation and harsh conditions of Scotland's outer islands. 3 such men were stationed at the lighthouse in December 1900. James Ducat, 43 years old, was the principal keeper. He had over 20 years of experience in the lighthouse service and was known for his steady, reliable nature. He left behind a wife and 4 children. Thomas Marshall, 40 years old, served as the second assistant keeper. Like Ducat, he was a veteran of the lighthouse service with an impeccable record. He had a wife and 2 children waiting for him on the mainland. The third man was Donald MacArthur, also 40, who worked as an occasional keeper. MacArthur had a reputation as a tough, sometimes violent man who had been known to get into fights, but he was also an experienced mariner who had served on ships before joining the lighthouse service. He too had a wife and 2 children. These 3 men had been working together at the lighthouse for several months. The routine was well established. The lighthouse operated on a rotation system, with keepers working for 6 weeks at a time before being relieved by colleagues from the mainland. The relief ship would arrive every 2 weeks, bringing fresh supplies and mail, and every 6 weeks it would bring replacement keepers. On December 15, 1900, the last entry was made in the lighthouse log. Everything appeared normal, the light was operating correctly, the weather was calm, and the 3 keepers were going about their daily duties. What happened next remains one of the most baffling mysteries in maritime history. The first sign that something was wrong came from an unexpected source. On December 20, 1900, the steamer Arctur was passing the Flannan Isles on its way to Leith when the captain noticed that the lighthouse was not operating. This was highly unusual and potentially dangerous, as the lighthouse was crucial for navigation in those treacherous waters. The captain made a note in his log and reported the incident when he reached port. The relief ship Hesperus was already scheduled to visit the lighthouse on December the 26th, bringing supplies and Joseph Moore, who was to relieve one of the keepers. Captain James Harvey commanded the Hesperus, and he was expecting a routine visit. As the ship approached the landing platform at Elian Moor, Harvey was surprised to see no one waiting for their arrival. Normally, at least one of the keepers would be visible, and they would have raised a flag on the flagstaff to acknowledge the ship's approach. Harvey sounded the ship's horn, a signal that would normally bring the keepers running to the landing platform. There was no response. He then ordered a flare to be fired, hoping to attract attention from the lighthouse. Still nothing. The silence from the island was complete and deeply unsettling. Joseph Moore, the relief keeper, was ordered to row ashore and investigate. As he made his way up the steep stone steps that led from the landing platform to the lighthouse, Moore later reported feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. The 160 steps seemed endless, and with each step his anxiety grew. Something was terribly wrong. When Moore reached the lighthouse compound, he found the main gate and door closed but not locked. This was the first sign of trouble. The door should have been open, and there should have been someone there to greet him. Moore called out but received no answer. He pushed open the door and stepped inside. The entrance hall was eerily quiet. Moore immediately noticed that 2 of the 3 oilskin coats that hung by the door were missing. Only 1 remained. This was strange because the weather was cold and wet, and no keeper would venture outside without proper protection. Moore continued into the kitchen area, where he found a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The kitchen table was set for a meal, but the food was only half eaten. A chair was overturned, as if someone had jumped up from it suddenly. The kitchen clock had stopped. Everything suggested that the keepers had been interrupted in the middle of their daily routine and had left quickly. But where had they gone? Moore searched the entire lighthouse from top to bottom. He checked the lamp room at the top of the tower, the living quarters, the storage rooms, and every corner of the building. There was no sign of the 3 keepers. Their personal belongings were still there, their beds were unmade, and there was no note or message explaining their absence. Deeply shaken, Moore ran back down the steps to the landing platform and signalled to Captain Harvey. The captain immediately ordered a thorough search of the island. Every crevice, every hiding place, every possible location where the men might have taken shelter was examined. They searched for hours, calling out the names of the missing keepers but found nothing. Captain Harvey realised he was dealing with a serious emergency. He immediately sent a telegram to the Northern Lighthouse Board headquarters in Edinburgh. The message was stark and chilling. A dreadful accident has happened at Flannan's. The 3 keepers, Duckett, Marshall and the Occasional have disappeared from the island. On our arrival there this afternoon, no sign of life was to be seen on the island. Fired a rocket, but, as no response was made, managed to land Moore, who went up to the station but found no keepers there. The clocks were stopped and other signs indicated that the accident must have happened about a week ago. Poor fellows, they must have been blown over the cliffs or drowned trying to secure a crane or something like that. The Northern Lighthouse Board was stunned by the news. 3 experienced keepers simply did not disappear without a trace. Robert Muirhead, the board's superintendent who had personally recruited all 3 men, was immediately dispatched to the island to conduct a thorough investigation. Muirhead arrived at Island Moor on December the 29th, 1900, and began what would become one of the most detailed investigations in lighthouse history. He knew all 3 men personally and was familiar with their work habits and personalities. His investigation would uncover clues that made the mystery even more baffling. The first thing Muirhead examined was the lighthouse log. What he found there defied explanation. The entries for the final few days were unlike anything he'd seen in decades of lighthouse service. On December 12th, Thomas Marshall had written about severe winds the likes of which I have never seen before in 20 years. He also noted that James Duckett had been very quiet, and that Donald MacArthur had been crying. The entry about MacArthur crying was particularly puzzling. MacArthur was known as a tough, hardened man who had never shown fear or emotion in the face of bad weather. He had worked on ships in some of the roughest seas around Scotland and had never been known to cry about a storm. Why would he be crying about weather conditions while safely housed in a lighthouse 150 feet above sea level? The log entry for December 13th was even more disturbing. Marshall wrote that the storm was still raging and that all 3 men had been praying. Again, this was completely out of character for these experienced men. They had weathered countless storms in their careers and had never felt the need to pray for their safety while on duty. The final entry, made on December 15th, was the most mysterious of all. It simply read, "Storm ended, sea calm, God is over all." The phrase "God is over all" was unusual and seemed to carry a deeper meaning than a simple weather report. But here was the most puzzling aspect of the log entries. According to weather records from the area, there had been no storms on December 12th, 13 or 14. The weather had been calm and clear. Ships passing through the area had reported no unusual conditions. The storms that the keepers wrote about in their log simply hadn't happened. Muirhead's investigation revealed other puzzling details. The oilskin coat that remained in the entrance hall belonged to Donald MacArthur. This meant that MacArthur had gone outside without his protective clothing, something no experienced keeper would ever do in December weather in the Outer Hebrides. The other 2 coats were missing, suggesting that Duckett and Marshall had gone outside, but MacArthur had followed them without proper protection. Down at the landing platform, Muirhead found evidence of significant damage. Ropes that were normally stored in a wooden box 70 feet above the platform had been scattered across the rocks. The box itself had been dislodged from its position on the supply crane. Heavy iron railings had been bent and twisted, and turf had been torn up from the cliff top. The damage was consistent with extremely violent waves, but the evidence suggested this damage had occurred before the keeper's disappearance, not as a result of it. The keepers would have been aware of the damage and would have noted it in their log if it had happened during their watch. Muirhead's official report concluded that the 3 keepers had probably been swept away by a massive wave while trying to secure equipment at the landing platform. This seemed like the most logical explanation. The men had gone down to the platform to repair damage or retrieve scattered equipment, and an unexpected wave had caught them off guard. But this explanation raised more questions than it answered. Why would 3 experienced men all leave their posts at the same time, violating the fundamental rule that at least one keeper must remain in the lighthouse at all times? Why would they go down to the dangerous landing platform in rough weather? Why had no bodies been recovered? And most importantly, why had they written about storms that hadn't happened? The weather records from the time showed that the seas had been calm from December the 12th through December 17th. The lighthouse could be seen clearly from the Isle of Lewis during this period, which meant there was no heavy weather to obscure the view. The first real storm didn't hit the area until December 17th, 2 days after the last log entry. Some investigators have suggested that the keepers experienced a localized weather event that wasn't recorded elsewhere. The waters around the Flannan Isles are notoriously unpredictable, and it's possible that severe conditions could have affected the islands while leaving the surrounding area calm. But even this explanation doesn't account for why 3 experienced men would all leave their posts simultaneously. The psychological state of the keepers, as recorded in their final log entries, has led to other theories. Some investigators have suggested that one of the men, possibly MacArthur, had suffered a mental breakdown and that the other 2 had been trying to help him when disaster struck. MacArthur's reputation for violence has led some to speculate that he might have attacked the other 2 men, though there was no evidence of violence at the lighthouse. Another theory suggests that the keepers had witnessed something so terrifying that it drove them to flee the lighthouse. The log entries about praying and the final phrase "God is over all" could indicate that they had encountered something beyond their understanding. But what could have frightened 3 experienced men so badly that they would abandon their posts? The investigation also revealed that the lighthouse had been dark for several days before the relief ship arrived. This meant that ships passing through the area had been navigating without the crucial light, putting them at risk of running aground on the treacherous rocks around the islands. The keepers would have been acutely aware of their responsibility to keep the light burning, making their abandonment of the lighthouse even more puzzling. Over the years, various theories have been proposed to explain the disappearance. Some have suggested that the men were captured by foreign agents or pirates, though there was no evidence of any struggle or forced entry. Others have proposed that they were swept away by a rogue wave while trying to secure equipment, though this doesn't explain why they all left their posts together. The most persistent theories focus on the strange weather conditions described in the log. Some investigators have suggested that the keepers experienced a supernatural event that drove them to their deaths. The island's reputation for being haunted, combined with the isolation and stress of the job, could have led to a collective psychological breakdown. In recent years, new evidence has emerged that may shed light on the mystery. Advanced weather modelling has shown that the waters around the Flannan Isles can experience sudden, violent changes that aren't reflected in regional weather patterns. It's possible that the keepers did experience the severe conditions they wrote about, even if those conditions weren't recorded elsewhere. The lighthouse on Olean Moor continued to operate after the tragedy, with new keepers taking over the duties, but many of the men who worked there in subsequent years reported strange experiences. They heard voices calling out the names of the 3 missing keepers, saw unexplained lights moving around the island, and felt an overwhelming sense of unease during their shifts, The Sodder Children, Christmas Eve 1945. In the small town of Fayetteville, West Virginia, the Sodder family is settling in for what should be a peaceful holiday night. George and Jenny Sodder have built a good life in America. George, originally named Giorgio Soddu, had immigrated from the island of Sardinia in 1908 when he was just 13 years old. He worked hard, started his own trucking business, and married Jenny Cipriani, who'd come to America from Italy as a small child. Together, they had 10 children and were known as one of the most respected families in their community. The Sodder house on Christmas Eve was full of life. 9 of their 10 children were home that night. Joe, 21, had just been discharged from the army the day before but wasn't at the house. The younger children were excited about Christmas and had been allowed to stay up late to play with toys their older sister Marion had bought them. George and his older sons, John and George Jr., had gone to bed early, tired from a long day working at the family's coal trucking business. By 10:30 that night, Jenny had taken the youngest child, 3-year-old Sylvia, to bed with her. The house was settling into quiet, with Marion falling asleep on the living room sofa. The 5 middle children, Morris 14, Martha 12, Lewis 10, Jenny 8 and Betty 5, were getting ready for bed in their upstairs rooms. Just after midnight the phone rang. Jenny got up to answer it, still groggy from sleep. On the other end was a woman's voice she didn't recognize, asking for someone who didn't live at their house. Jenny told the caller she had the wrong number, but instead of hanging up, the woman let out what Jenny later described as a strange laugh. In the background, Jenny could hear the sounds of a party, glasses clinking, people talking loudly, music playing. It was an odd time for such a call, and the woman's laugh bothered Jenny, but she hung up and went back to bed. As she walked through the house, Jenny noticed something strange. All the downstairs lights were still on, and the curtains were open. The front door was unlocked. This was unusual because the family was always careful about locking up at night. She turned off the lights, closed the curtains, and locked the door before returning to her bedroom. About 30 minutes later, Jenny heard a loud thump on the roof, followed by a rolling sound, as if something had hit the roof and rolled off. She was tired and didn't think much of it at the time. She tried to go back to sleep, but something felt wrong. The house seemed too quiet, too still. Around 1 a.m., Jenny woke up to the smell of smoke. She opened her eyes and saw flames in her husband's office, which was on the first floor. The fire was already spreading and smoke was filling the room. She shook George awake and they both realized immediately that they were in serious trouble. George tried to call the fire department, but the phone was dead. The flames were blocking their path to the phone anyway. Jenny ran to wake up Marion, who was still sleeping on the sofa, and told her to take Sylvia outside immediately. George and his older sons, John and George Jr., woke up and ran downstairs, but the staircase leading to the second floor was already engulfed in flames. The 5 younger children, Morris, Martha, Lewis, Jenny and Betty, were trapped upstairs. George called out their names, but there was no response. He couldn't hear them crying or calling for help, which struck him as strange. In a house fire, you would expect to hear children screaming or calling for their parents. George knew he had to act fast. He ran outside, planning to get the ladder he always kept propped against the house. He could use it to reach the second-floor windows where his children were sleeping. But when he got to where the ladder should have been, it was gone. This was the first of several strange things that would happen that night. Desperate, George decided to drive one of his coal trucks up to the house. If he could position it correctly, he might be able to climb on top of the cab and reach the upstairs windows. But when he tried to start the truck, the engine wouldn't turn over. This was puzzling because the truck had been running perfectly just the day before. He tried the second truck, but it wouldn't start either. George ran to a rain barrel to get water to fight the fire, but the December cold had frozen the water solid. He was running out of options, and the fire was spreading rapidly through the house. Marion had run to a neighbour's house to call the fire department, but she couldn't get through to an operator. A neighbour who saw the fire also tried to call from a nearby tavern, but again no operator responded. Finally, someone drove into town and found Fire Chief F.J. Morris. Fayetteville's fire department operated on a phone tree system, where one firefighter would call another, who would call another, and so on. The fire station was only 2.5 miles away, but the fire department didn't arrive until 8 a.m. By then, the 2-story house had burned completely to the ground. The fire had burned for 45 minutes before the house collapsed, but it continued to smoulder all night. When the firefighters finally arrived, they found nothing but a pile of ash and the stone foundation. George and Jenny were devastated. They assumed their 5 children had died in the fire, but when they searched through the ashes on Christmas Day, they found something disturbing. There were no human remains. Fire Chief Morris suggested that the fire had been so hot that it had completely cremated the children's bodies, leaving no trace. But George and Jenny found this hard to believe. They had found the remnants of household appliances in the basement, a washing machine, a piano, other metal objects that had survived the fire. How could 5 children's bodies be completely destroyed when these items remained? The official investigation concluded that the fire had been caused by faulty electrical wiring. A state police inspector signed off on this finding, and death certificates were issued for all 5 children on December 30th, just 5 days after the fire. The cause of death was listed as fire or suffocation. But as the shock wore off, George and Jenny began to remember strange things that had happened in the weeks and months before the fire. About 6 months earlier, a man had come to their house asking about hauling work. He had wandered around to the back of the house and pointed to their electrical fuse boxes. "This is going to cause a fire someday," he'd said. George thought this was an odd comment, especially since he had recently had the wiring inspected by the local power company, which had found it in perfect condition. Around the same time, another man had tried to sell them life insurance. When George declined, the man became angry and threatening. "Your house is going to go up in smoke," he had warned, "and your children are going to be destroyed. You're going to pay for the dirty remarks you have been making about Mussolini." George was known for his outspoken criticism of the Italian dictator, which sometimes led to heated arguments with other Italian Americans in the community. The family also remembered that in the weeks before Christmas, they had noticed a man in a parked car watching their younger children as they came home from school. He would sit there for long periods, just watching, never getting out of the car or talking to anyone. The mysterious phone call that woke Jenny just before the fire also bothered the family. Who calls at midnight on Christmas Eve asking for someone who doesn't live at that address? And why had the woman laughed so strangely when told she had the wrong number? As they thought about the night of the fire, more strange details emerged. The ladder that George always kept against the house hadn't just fallen down, it was completely gone. Someone had moved it. The trucks that wouldn't start had been working perfectly the day before. A telephone repairman later told them that their phone lines appeared to have been cut, not burned in the fire. The family also realised something important about the fire itself. If it had really been caused by faulty electrical wiring, as the official report claimed, then the electricity should have gone out when the fire started, but the lights in the downstairs rooms had been on and working during the fire. This suggested that the fire hadn't started from an electrical problem. In 1947, frustrated by the lack of investigation, George and Jenny wrote to the FBI. They received a response from FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who said that while he would like to help, the matter appeared to be of local character and didn't fall under federal jurisdiction. The FBI said they would assist if they could get permission from local authorities, but the Fayetteville police and fire departments declined the offer. The Sodders then hired a private investigator named C.C. Tinsley. His investigation revealed even more disturbing information. The insurance salesman who had threatened George was actually a member of the coroner's jury that had ruled the fire accidental. This man had previously worked for George and had been fired. More importantly, he had increased the family's home insurance from $1,500 to $1,750 just before the fire, without George or Jenny's knowledge or consent. The investigator also discovered something troubling about Fire Chief Morris. While Morris had publicly stated that no human remains had been found in the fire, he had privately told someone that he had found a human heart in the ashes. He claimed to have put it in a dynamite box and buried it at the scene. When the Sodders heard this, they immediately had the area excavated and found the box. They took it to a local funeral director, who examined the contents and determined that it was beef liver, not a human heart, and that it had never been exposed to fire. When confronted about this, Morris allegedly admitted that he had placed the fake remains in the rubble, hoping it would convince the family to stop investigating. The family began to hear reports of sightings of their children. A woman claimed she had seen the missing children looking out of a passing car while the fire was still burning. Another woman, who operated a tourist stop between Fayetteville and Charleston, said she'd served breakfast to the children the morning after the fire. She said they were in a car with Florida license plates. A woman at a Charleston hotel saw the children's photos in a newspaper and said she had seen 4 of the 5 children about a week after the fire. She said the children were with 2 men and 2 women, all of Italian descent. The woman said she tried to talk to the children in a friendly way, but the men became hostile and spoke rapidly in Italian, cutting off any conversation. In 1949, 4 years after the fire, George decided to have the site thoroughly excavated. He brought in a pathologist from Washington, D.C. named Oscar B. Hunter. The excavation uncovered several small objects, damaged coins, a partly burned dictionary, and most importantly, several pieces of human vertebrae. The bones were sent to the Smithsonian Institution for analysis. The report concluded that the vertebrae belonged to a single individual, probably a male between 16 and 22 years old. The bones showed no evidence of being exposed to fire, which was strange if they had come from victims of the house fire. The report also noted that it was very unusual to find only 4 vertebrae when you would expect to find complete skeletons of 5 children. The Smithsonian report suggested that the bones had probably been in the soil that George used to fill in the basement when he created a memorial for his children. They hadn't been there at the time of the fire. The most intriguing development came in 1967, more than 20 years after the fire. Jenny received an envelope postmarked from Central City, Kentucky. Inside was a photograph of a man who appeared to be in his mid-20s. On the back of the photo was written Louis Sodder, followed by a cryptic message. "I love brother Frankie, ill boys, a 90,132 or 35. The resemblance between the man in the photo and Louis Sodder was striking. They had the same dark curly hair, the same brown eyes, the same straight nose, and the same distinctive upward tilt of the left eyebrow. George and Jenny were convinced this was their son Louis, who would have been about the right age. The message on the back of the photo was puzzling. Louis didn't have a brother named Frank, but Jenny's maiden name was Cipriani, and she did have a brother named Frank. The family had long suspected that a man named Frank Cipriani might have been involved in kidnapping their children. The ill boys phrase remains a mystery, but some investigators have suggested that a 90,132 or 35 inches might refer to postal codes, possibly in Italy. The family hired another private investigator and sent him to Kentucky to investigate the photo. They never heard from him again. Whether he found something and was threatened into silence, or whether he simply took their money and disappeared, they never knew. In 1967, the family also received a letter from a woman in Houston who claimed that she'd met Louis and Maurice in a bar, where Louis had confessed that they were the missing Sodder brothers. George's son-in-law drove George to Houston to meet with these men, but they denied being the Sodder children. George died in 1969, still believing that his children had been kidnapped rather than killed in the fire. Jenny continued to search for answers until her death in 1989. For nearly 4 decades, anyone driving down Route 16 near Fayetteville could see a billboard the family had erected, showing photos of the 5 missing children and asking, what was their fate? Kidnapped, murdered, or are they still alive? The billboard offered a reward that eventually grew to $10,000 for information leading to the recovery of any of the children. Jenny wore black clothing every day from the fire until her death, as a sign of mourning for her lost children. The case raised disturbing questions about the competence and honesty of the local authorities. Why had the fire department taken 7 hours to respond to a call just 2.5 miles away? Why had the phone lines been cut? Why had the fire chief planted fake human remains at the scene? Why had the insurance salesman who had threatened George been allowed to serve on the coroner's jury? The Sodders never wavered in their belief that their children had been kidnapped. They thought the fire was set as a diversion while someone took their children. The evidence they uncovered suggested that the fire was not accidental, but rather part of a carefully planned operation. Some investigators have suggested that the kidnapping might have been related to George's outspoken criticism of Mussolini and his refusal to support certain Italian-American organizations that may have had connections to organized crime. Others have proposed that it might have been a simple case of mistaken identity, with the wrong family being targeted. The case remains officially unsolved. The last surviving member of the family, Sylvia, died in 2021 at age 79, still believing that her siblings had survived the fire and been taken away. Modern investigators continue to examine the evidence, but after nearly 80 years, the truth about what happened to the Sodder children may never be known. Flight 19, the Bermuda Triangle, It's December 5th, 1945. The Second World War has been over for just 4 months, and the United States Navy is still conducting training exercises to keep its pilots sharp. At the Naval Air Station, Fort Lauderdale in Florida, 14 men are about to embark on what should be a routine training flight. None of them know they're about to become part of one of aviation's most enduring mysteries. The day starts normally enough. The weather is decent for December in Florida, partly cloudy with a temperature of 67 degrees. There's a southwest trade wind gusting across the airfield, but nothing unusual for the season. Flight 19, as it's designated, consists of 5 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers, each carrying 3 crew members. These are sturdy, reliable aircraft that have served the Navy well throughout the war. The mission is simple and straightforward. The squadron is to fly due east from Fort Lauderdale for 141 miles to a bombing range at the Hen and Chicken Shoals in the Bahamas. There, they'll practice dropping their torpedoes on target. After completing their bombing run, they'll turn north for 73 miles, then west for 140 miles back to Fort Lauderdale. It's a triangular flight pattern that the pilots have flown many times before. For most of the crew, this is their final training exercise before graduation. Leading the flight is Lieutenant Charles Carroll Taylor, a 28-year-old instructor pilot from Texas. Taylor is no rookie. He has over 2,500 flight hours under his belt, including 616 hours in the TBM Avenger. He's a combat veteran who served aboard the USS Hancock in the Pacific Theater, participating in dangerous missions against Japanese forces. He's been recently transferred to Fort Lauderdale from Miami, arriving just 2 weeks earlier on November 21st. The other pilots are a mix of Navy and Marine Corps personnel. Captain Edward Joseph Powers, a 26-year-old Marine from New York, is actually the senior officer on the flight, but he's technically a student pilot on the Avenger. Powers is a Princeton graduate who gave up a comfortable position as a training instructor to pursue his dream of flying torpedo bombers. He's married with children, and his wife would later report feeling a strange premonition about this flight. The other pilots are young men in their early 20s. Captain George William Stivers Jr., a 25-year-old Marine from Missouri who's an Annapolis graduate and decorated combat veteran. Second Lieutenant Forrest James Gerber, a 24-year-old Marine from Minnesota who received his wings just 4 months earlier. And Ensign Joseph Tipton Bossy, a 20-year-old Navy pilot from Kansas who passed up a discharge to stay in the service. The crew members range in age from 17 to 28, many of them combat veterans despite their youth. Some have seen action in the Pacific, including battles at Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and other bloody engagements. They're experienced professional military men who know their jobs well. At 2:10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, the 5 Avengers taxi down the runway at Fort Lauderdale and take off into the afternoon sky. The formation heads east toward the Bahamas, climbing to their cruising altitude. Radio contact with the base is normal, and the flight proceeds according to plan. The bombing exercise at the Hen and Chicken Shoals goes smoothly. The pilots practice their torpedo runs, dropping their ordnance on the designated targets. By all accounts, this part of the mission is completed successfully. The planes form up and begin the second leg of their journey, turning north as planned. It's about 90 minutes into the flight when the first signs of trouble emerge. Lieutenant Taylor radios the base, reporting that his compass is malfunctioning. This isn't necessarily a major problem. Compass failures happen, and experienced pilots are trained to navigate using landmarks and dead reckoning. But Taylor's next transmission is more concerning. He reports that he's lost and can't determine his position. What happens next has been the subject of debate for decades. According to radio transmissions that were monitored by the base, Taylor believes he's over the Florida Keys, the chain of islands at the southern tip of Florida. If this is true, then flying northeast should take them back to Fort Lauderdale. But Taylor is wrong about his position, and this mistake will prove fatal. The radio transmissions from Flight 19 become increasingly desperate as the afternoon wears on. Taylor can be heard discussing the situation with his fellow pilots. At one point, he says, "Both my compasses are out, and I'm trying to find Fort Lauderdale, Florida. I'm over land, but it's broken. I'm sure I'm in the Keys, but I don't know how far down and I don't know how to get to Fort Lauderdale." But Taylor isn't over the Keys. Based on the flight path and timing, he's actually over the Bahamas, looking down at the scattered islands and thinking they're the Florida Keys. The 2 island chains look similar from the air, and it's an understandable mistake for a pilot whose compass has failed. However, this confusion leads him to make a critical error in navigation. Because Taylor thinks he's over the Keys, he orders the flight to turn northeast, believing this will take them back to the Florida mainland. In reality, this heading takes them further out over the Atlantic Ocean, away from land and safety. The other pilots in the formation begin to express concern. Captain Powers, who outranks Taylor but is considered a student pilot on the Avenger, suggests they should turn west toward the Florida coast. But Taylor is the designated flight leader, and he insists on continuing northeast. The radio transmissions become more fragmentary as the afternoon progresses. Weather conditions are deteriorating, with storms moving into the area. The planes are fighting headwinds and consuming fuel faster than anticipated. At one point, Taylor can be heard saying, "We're not sure where we are. We think we're 225 miles northeast of base." Lieutenant Robert Cox, a senior flight instructor who's in the air but not part of Flight 19, picks up the transmissions and tries to help. Cox has been listening to the increasingly desperate radio calls and realizes the flight is in serious trouble. He tries to establish radio contact with Taylor to provide navigation assistance, but the transmissions are weak and difficult to understand. In one of the most famous exchanges, Taylor reportedly says, "We don't know where we are. Everything is strange. Even the ocean doesn't look as it should." The exact wording of this transmission has been disputed over the years, but the essence is clear: the flight is completely lost, and Taylor is becoming increasingly disoriented. By 4:45 p.m, Taylor's transmissions indicate he's ordering the flight to turn due west, finally recognizing that they need to head toward the Florida coast. But this decision may have come too late. The planes have been flying for over 2.5 hours, and their fuel supplies are running dangerously low. The TBM Avenger has a maximum flight time of about 5 hours under ideal conditions, but the planes have been fighting headwinds and making course corrections, which increases fuel consumption. At 5:15 p.m, Taylor makes his final transmission. All planes close up tight. We'll have to ditch unless landfall. When the first plane drops below 10 gallons, we all go down together. The radio falls silent after this message. Flight 19 has vanished. The disappearance triggers one of the largest search and rescue operations in naval history. Within hours, the Navy mobilizes a massive effort to find the missing planes. The search involves 248 Navy aircraft, 18 Coast Guard vessels, and dozens of civilian ships and planes. The baby aircraft carrier USS Solomons joins the search, along with units from the Army Air Force and the Royal Air Force Base in Nassau. But as the search gets underway, another tragedy strikes. A PBM Mariner flying boat designated Training 49 takes off from Naval Air Station Banana River to join the search effort. The Mariner carries 13 crew members and is equipped with rescue equipment. At 7:27 p.m, less than 30 minutes after takeoff, the rescue plane radios that it's approaching Flight 19's last known position. This is the last transmission ever received from Training 49. The merchant ship SS Gaines Mills, which is participating in the search, reports seeing an explosion at sea off New Smyrna Beach at 7:50 p.m. The crew observes what appears to be an airplane falling from the sky, followed by a widespread oil slick on the water. Despite searching for survivors, they find nothing. The PBM Mariner and its 13-man crew have vanished just as completely as Flight 19. The search continues for days, covering more than 200,000 square miles of ocean and land. Navy Captain Frank Daly, flying a PBY seaplane, later recalls searching for 3 days, 6 hours a day, ploughing up and down the whole coast of Florida, looking for wreckage, but we never saw a thing. Lieutenant David White, a flight instructor at Fort Lauderdale, joins the search effort and is equally frustrated by the lack of evidence. "They just vanished," he says. "We had hundreds of planes out looking and we searched over land and water for days, and nobody ever found the bodies or any debris." The official Navy investigation concludes that Flight 19 was lost due to pilot error. The board determines that Lieutenant Taylor became confused about his location and led the flight in the wrong direction, causing them to run out of fuel and crash into the ocean. The investigation initially places blame on Taylor, finding him guilty of mental aberration and holding him responsible for the loss of lives and aircraft. But this finding doesn't sit well with Taylor's family. His mother, Catherine Taylor, launches her own investigation and appeals to the board for correction of naval records. She argues that her son was an experienced pilot who wouldn't have made such basic navigation errors without some external factor causing the confusion. In 1947, the board reverses its decision and clears Taylor of responsibility, changing the official cause to reasons unknown. The mystery of Flight 19 deepens when investigators examine the evidence more closely. Taylor's compass malfunction is confirmed, but experienced pilots are trained to navigate without compasses. The weather conditions, while not ideal, weren't severe enough to cause 5 experienced pilots to become completely lost. The radio transmissions suggest that Taylor was seeing things that didn't make sense to him. Islands that looked wrong, ocean that appeared strange. Some investigators have suggested that Flight 19 encountered unusual electromagnetic phenomena that affected their instruments and navigation equipment. The area where they disappeared would later become famous as part of the Bermuda Triangle, a region where numerous aircraft and ships have allegedly vanished under mysterious circumstances. Theories range from magnetic anomalies to time warps to extraterrestrial interference. More conventional explanations focus on the challenges of navigation in the area. The Bahamas and Florida Keys do look similar from the air, and a pilot with a malfunctioning compass could easily become confused. The weather was deteriorating throughout the afternoon, which would have made visual navigation more difficult. The planes were flying in formation, which meant that if the lead pilot made a mistake, all 5 aircraft would follow him off course. The disappearance of the PBM Mariner adds another layer to the mystery. The Mariner was known to have fuel vapor problems that could cause explosions, which might explain the fireballs seen by the SS Gaines Mills. But the timing of the explosion, just as the rescue plane was approaching Flight 19's last known position, seems too coincidental for some investigators. One of the most puzzling aspects of the case is the complete lack of debris. Even if all 5 Avengers had crashed into the ocean, some wreckage should have been found. The planes were equipped with life rafts and emergency equipment that would have floated. The crew members wore life vests, yet despite one of the most extensive searches in naval history, not a single piece of confirmed wreckage was ever recovered. Over the years, various pieces of aircraft wreckage have been found in the waters off Florida, but none have been definitively linked to Flight 19. In 1989, a TBM Avenger was discovered in the Everglades, but investigators determined it wasn't one of the missing planes. Underwater searches have located other Avenger wrecks, but again, none match the specifications of Flight 19's aircraft. The human element of the tragedy is often overlooked in discussions of the mystery. 14 men died that day, ranging in age from 17 to 28. They left behind families, friends, and futures that would never be fulfilled. George Devlin, the 17-year-old gunner on Taylor's plane, had enlisted under a false name because he was eager to serve his country. He was in the process of having his name legally changed when he disappeared. Walter Parpart, the 18-year-old radioman, left behind a family that would spend decades wondering what happened to their son. The disappearance of Flight 19 occurred during a period of transition for the United States military. The war was over, but the Cold War was beginning. The Navy was reducing its forces and transitioning from wartime to peacetime operations. The loss of 5 aircraft and 14 men was a significant blow to a service that was already dealing with budget cuts and personnel reductions. The case has been the subject of countless books, documentaries, and investigations. The History Channel, National Geographic, and other networks have produced numerous programs about Flight 19. Authors and researchers have spent decades trying to solve the mystery, proposing theories that range from the mundane to the extraordinary. Some investigators have focused on the possibility that the planes crashed on land rather than in the ocean. The Everglades and other remote areas of Florida have been searched repeatedly, but no confirmed wreckage has been found. Others have suggested that the planes were caught in a sudden storm and crashed in deep water, where they've never been located. The mystery has also spawned its share of conspiracy theories. Some claim that Flight 19 was carrying classified equipment or personnel and was shot down to prevent sensitive information from falling into enemy hands. Others suggest that the planes were used in secret experiments that went wrong. These theories lack credible evidence, but they continue to circulate online and in popular culture. The families of the missing men have never stopped looking for answers. For decades, they've followed up on reported sightings, investigated new theories, and pushed for continued research into the disappearance. The Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale Museum, located on the former site of the base where Flight 19 took off, maintains extensive archives about the case and continues to receive new information from researchers and the public. Modern technology has brought new tools to the investigation. Satellite imagery, underwater robotics, and advanced sonar equipment have all been used in attempts to locate the missing planes. Computer modelling has been used to analyse the flight path and predict where the aircraft might have crashed. But despite these technological advances, Flight 19 remains missing. The case has become a defining example of the mysteries associated with the Bermuda Triangle. While many scientists reject the idea that the area has unusual properties, the concentration of unexplained disappearances in the region continues to fascinate researchers and the public. Flight 19 isn't the only aircraft to vanish in the area, but it's certainly the most famous and well-documented case. Weather records from December 5, 1945, show that conditions were marginal but not severe enough to cause 5 experienced pilots to become completely lost. The planes took off in daylight with good visibility, and the weather didn't deteriorate significantly until later in the afternoon. This suggests that something other than weather was responsible for the navigational problems that led to the disaster. The radio transmissions from Flight 19 provide the most direct evidence of what happened, but they also raise more questions than they answer. Taylor's reports of compass malfunctions and disorientation are consistent with equipment failure, but his descriptions of the landscape and ocean looking strange suggest something more unusual was happening. The other pilots' attempts to take control of the situation show that they recognized the danger, but they were unable to prevent the tragedy. The lost colony of Roanoke. The year is 1587, and off the coast of what we now call North Carolina, a small group of English settlers is about to become part of history's most enduring mystery. On Roanoke Island, 115 men, women and children are building what they hope will be the first permanent English settlement in the New World. They have no idea that within 3 years, every trace of their existence will vanish, leaving behind only questions that have puzzled historians for over 4 centuries. The story begins with Sir Walter Raleigh, one of Queen Elizabeth's most ambitious courtiers. In 1584, Raleigh received a royal charter to establish a colony in North America. This wasn't just about exploration or adventure. England was watching Spain grow rich from its American colonies, and they wanted their own piece of the New World. Raleigh chose Roanoke Island because it seemed perfect, protected by the Outer Banks, with access to the mainland and the ocean. The first attempt came in 1585, when Raleigh sent 108 colonists to the island. But things went wrong from the start. The colonists struggled with food shortages, and tensions with local Native American tribes grew dangerous. After just 1 year, when Sir Francis Drake arrived with his fleet, the desperate colonists abandoned their settlement and sailed back to England. But Raleigh wasn't giving up. In 1587, he organised a second expedition. This time, he chose John White, an artist and mapmaker who had been with the first group to lead the colony. White was different from the previous military leaders. He understood the importance of peaceful relations with the Native Americans, and he brought families, not just soldiers. Among the 115 colonists were women and children, including White's own pregnant daughter, Eleanor Dare. The new colonists arrived at Roanoke Island in July 1587. They found the remnants of the previous settlement, but it was mostly ruins. Still, they set to work rebuilding. On August 18, 1587, Eleanor Dare gave birth to a daughter, Virginia Dare. She would become famous as the first English child born in the Americas, though no one at the time could have imagined the tragic circumstances that would make her name remembered. The colonists faced immediate challenges. Their supplies were running low, and winter was approaching. The local Croatoan tribe, led by Chief Manteo, was friendly, but other tribes in the area were hostile. The colonists realised they needed help from England, and they needed it fast. John White made a difficult decision. He would return to England to get supplies and reinforcements, leaving his daughter, son-in-law, and newborn granddaughter behind. The colonists agreed to this plan, but they also agreed on something else. If they had to leave Roanoke Island for any reason, they would carve the name of their destination into a prominent tree or post. If they were in distress, they would carve a cross above the name. White sailed for England in late August 1587, expecting to return within a few months. But fate had other plans. When he reached England, the country was preparing for war with Spain. The Spanish Armada was approaching, and Queen Elizabeth ordered that no ships could leave English ports. Every vessel was needed for national defence. White tried everything he could to get back to his colony. He secured 2 small ships in 1588, but pirates attacked them before they could reach America. The ships were forced to return to England. White watched helplessly as months turned into years. The war with Spain dragged on, and private investors weren't interested in funding a risky voyage to a struggling colony. Finally, in 1590, White managed to secure passage on a privateering expedition. The captain agreed to stop at Roanoke Island, but only briefly. On August 18th, 1590, exactly 3 years after Virginia Dare's birth and what should have been her 3rd birthday, White's ship reached the Outer Banks. What White found that day has haunted historians ever since. The settlement was completely abandoned. The houses had been taken down carefully, not destroyed by violence. The colonists' belongings were gone. There were no bodies, no signs of struggle, no indication of what had happened to 115 people. But there was one clue. Carved into a wooden post of the palisade that surrounded the settlement was a single word: Croatoan. White also found the letters CRO carved into a nearby tree. There was no cross above either carving, which meant the colonists hadn't been in immediate danger when they left the message. White knew exactly what the message meant. Croatoan was the name of an island about 50 miles south of Roanoke, now known as Hatteras Island. It was home to the Croatoan tribe, the same Native Americans who had been friendly to the colonists. The word itself, according to linguists, might have meant council town or talk town in the Algonquian language. White was desperate to sail to Croatoan Island immediately. If the colonists had moved there, they might still be alive. His daughter, his granddaughter, and all the other settlers could be safe with the friendly tribe. But as White prepared to set sail, a fierce storm struck the area. The ship's anchor cables snapped, and the captain insisted they had to leave immediately or risk being driven onto the dangerous shoals of the Outer Banks. White never made it to Croatoan Island. The ship was forced to return to England, and John White never saw his family again. He died around 1593, never knowing what happened to the colonists he had left behind. The mystery of the lost colony has spawned countless theories over the centuries. Some historians believe the colonists did exactly what the carving suggested. They moved to Croatoan Island and integrated with the local tribe. Archaeological evidence from the late 20th century has supported this theory. Excavations on Hatteras Island have uncovered European artifacts in Native American sites, including items that could only have come from the Roanoke colonists. Other theories are more dramatic. Some suggest the colonists tried to return to England on their own and were lost at sea. Others propose they moved inland and were killed by hostile tribes. A few theories even suggest they split into multiple groups, with some going to Croatoan Island and others heading in different directions. Recent archaeological work has added new pieces to the puzzle. In 2012, researchers examining John White's original maps discovered hidden markings that seem to indicate other locations where the colonists might have gone. Ground-penetrating radar and other modern techniques have revealed buried structures and artifacts that might be connected to the lost colonists. The environmental conditions at the time also played a role in the mystery. Tree ring data from the region shows that the area experienced the worst drought in 800 years between 1587 and 1589. This extreme weather would have made survival incredibly difficult, especially for European colonists who weren't familiar with the local environment. DNA studies of modern Native American populations in the area have shown some intriguing results. Some families have genetic markers that could indicate European ancestry from the right time period. While this isn't conclusive proof, it supports the theory that at least some of the colonists survived and integrated with local tribes. The story of the lost colony remains one of America's oldest and most persistent mysteries. Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas, has become a symbol of the mystery. Her fate, like that of all the colonists, remains unknown. Did she grow up among the Croatoan people? Did she survive to adulthood? Did she have children of her own who might have passed down European genes to future generations? What makes the Roanoke mystery so compelling is how complete the disappearance was. This wasn't a case of a few people vanishing. It was an entire community of 115 people who simply weren't there anymore. They left behind organised evidence that they had moved somewhere else, but that somewhere else has never been definitively located. The careful way the settlement was dismantled suggests the colonists had time to plan their departure. They weren't fleeing from immediate danger or attack. They packed their belongings, took down their houses, and left clear instructions about where they were going. Yet somehow, they vanished completely from the historical record. The Ourang Medan ghost ship, June 1947. The waters of the Strait of Malacca, between Malaysia and Indonesia, are busy with merchant traffic. Ships from all over the world pass through these narrow waters, carrying goods between Asia and the rest of the world. It's a hot, humid day, and the radio operators aboard various vessels are monitoring the standard maritime frequencies, listening for weather reports and shipping updates. Suddenly, at around 11:30 a.m, radio operators on several ships pick up a distress signal. The transmission is weak and full of static, but the message is clear enough to send chills down their spines. A Dutch merchant vessel named the SS Ourang Medan is in serious trouble. The first message comes through in Morse code. SOS from Ourang Medan. We float. All officers including the captain dead in chart room and on the bridge, probably whole of crew dead. The radio operators listening to this transmission look at each other in confusion. How can someone be sending a distress signal if the entire crew is dead? After a few seconds of silence, another message comes through the static. I die. Then, nothing. The radio falls silent, leaving the operators staring at their equipment in disbelief. Two American merchant ships, the City of Baltimore and the Silver Star, are close enough to respond to the distress call. Both vessels immediately change course and head toward the coordinates given in the transmission. The Silver Star, being closer to the position, arrives first at the scene. What the crew of the Silver Star finds floating in the calm waters of the Strait of Malacca is a sight that will haunt them for the rest of their lives. The SS Ourang Medan appears to be in perfect condition. No visible damage to the hull, no signs of fire or collision, no indication of what might have caused the crew to send such a desperate message. The Dutch vessel floats silently on the water, drifting with the current. There's no movement on deck, no one visible at the bridge, no sign of life anywhere on the ship. The Silver Star's captain orders several crew members to row over to the Ourang Medan and investigate. As they approach the Dutch ship, the boarding party notices something deeply unsettling. The absolute silence is complete. No sounds of machinery, no voices, no movement. Even the usual creaking sounds that ships make are strangely muffled. The only sound is the gentle lapping of water against the hull. The American sailors climb aboard the Ourang Medan and immediately realize they've stepped into a nightmare. The deck is littered with bodies. Crew members lying on their backs, their faces frozen in expressions of absolute terror. Their eyes are wide open, staring at the sky, their mouths gaping as if they died screaming. Their arms are stretched out, reaching for something that isn't there. The boarding party moves carefully through the ship, discovering more bodies at every turn. In the wheelhouse, they find the captain slumped over the navigation table, his face contorted in the same expression of horror. The radio operator is found at his station, his hand still reaching for the transmitter, presumably the man who sent the final message, I die. What disturbs the American sailors most is the complete absence of any wounds or signs of violence. There's no blood, no evidence of fighting, no indication that the crew was attacked by pirates or enemy forces. The men appear to have died suddenly, all at the same time, while going about their normal duties. Even more puzzling is the discovery of the ship's dog, found dead near the galley with the same expression of terror frozen on its face. Whatever killed the crew of the Ourang Medan had affected every living thing on the ship. The boarding party searches the entire vessel from stem to stern. In the engine room, they find more bodies. The engineering crew had died at their posts, some with their hands still on the machinery. In the crew quarters, they find men who had apparently died in their sleep, but their faces show the same terrified expression as the others. Despite the tropical heat of the Strait of Malacca, the bodies feel unnaturally cold to the touch. Some of the American sailors later report that touching the corpses gave them an overwhelming sense of dread, as if something evil was still lingering on the ship. The cargo holds reveal no obvious explanation for the tragedy. The ship appears to be carrying a standard load of general merchandise, nothing that would obviously cause the death of an entire crew. The boarding party finds no evidence of toxic gas leaks, no signs of carbon monoxide poisoning, no indication of any kind of accident that could have killed everyone so quickly. After about an hour of investigation, the boarding party returns to the Silver Star to report their findings. The captain decides that the mysterious ship should be towed to the nearest port, where proper authorities can investigate the deaths. The crew prepares to secure towing lines to the Ourang Medan, but as they're preparing to attach the tow cable, something goes wrong. Smoke begins pouring from the Ourang Medan's cargo hold number 4. Within minutes, the smoke turns to flames and the fire spreads rapidly through the ship. The American sailors are forced to cut the tow lines and evacuate quickly to avoid being caught in the blaze. The crew of the Silver Star watches in amazement as the Ourang Medan burns. The fire spreads with unusual speed and intensity, as if the ship itself is eager to be consumed. Within an hour, the flames reach the cargo holds, and a massive explosion rocks the vessel. The blast is so powerful that it can be heard for miles, and the shockwave rocks the Silver Star despite being at a safe distance. The explosion tears the Ourang Medan apart, and the ship sinks rapidly beneath the waves. Any evidence of what killed the crew disappears into the depths of the Strait of Malacca, leaving only questions and the haunting memory of those terrified faces. The official report filed by the Silver Star's captain describes the incident in stark, factual terms, but several crew members later admit that the experience affected them deeply. Some report having nightmares about the dead crew's faces, while others say they can't shake the feeling that they witnessed something supernatural. Word of the incident spreads quickly through maritime circles. The story becomes even more mysterious when investigators try to find official records of the SS Ourang Medan. There's no registration for a Dutch merchant vessel by that name in any official shipping records. Lloyd's Register of Shipping, the authoritative source for vessel information, has no record of the Ourang Medan ever existing. The Dutch maritime authorities are contacted, but they have no record of the ship either. The vessel appears to have been completely unknown to official sources, raising questions about whether it was involved in illegal activities or operating under false documentation. The name Ourang Medan itself is puzzling. In Indonesian and Malay, Ourang means person or man, while Medan refers to the largest city on the Indonesian island of Sumatra. The name could be translated as man from Medan, but why a Dutch merchant vessel would have such a name is unclear. Some investigators suggest that the ship might have been involved in smuggling operations, which would explain why it doesn't appear in official records. The period just after World War II saw a lot of illicit activity in Southeast Asian waters, with various groups trying to move valuable or illegal cargo without government oversight. One theory that emerges focuses on the ship's cargo. Some investigators believe the Ourang Medan was carrying dangerous chemicals that somehow leaked and killed the crew. Hydrogen sulfide, carbon monoxide, or other toxic gases could potentially cause rapid death without leaving obvious wounds. The cold feeling of the bodies might be explained by the physiological effects of certain poisons. Another theory suggests the ship was carrying nerve agents or other chemical weapons left over from the war. The Japanese military had stockpiled various chemical weapons in Asia during the war, and some of these might have been sold on the black market after Japan's surrender. A leak in containers holding such materials could have killed the crew almost instantly. The rapid spread of the fire and the intensity of the explosion support theories about dangerous cargo. Normal merchant vessels don't typically burn so quickly or explode so violently. The behaviour of the fire suggests the presence of accelerants or explosive materials, but other aspects of the story don't fit standard explanations. The expressions of terror on the crew's faces suggest they saw something frightening before they died. Chemical poisoning typically doesn't cause such dramatic facial expressions. Most toxic gases cause victims to lose consciousness before they die. The fact that the ship's dog also died with the same terrified expression adds another puzzling element. Animals don't typically show human-like expressions of fear, yet multiple witnesses report that even the dog appeared to have died in terror. Some investigators have questioned whether the story of the Ourang Medan is entirely factual. The complete lack of official records, combined with the dramatic nature of the incident, has led some to suggest that the story might be exaggerated or even fictional. Research into the story's origins reveals interesting details. The earliest known account of the incident appeared in an Italian newspaper in 1940, describing a similar event in the Solomon Islands. The story was later republished in Dutch newspapers in 1948, with the location changed to the Strait of Malacca and additional details added. The 1940 version of the story mentioned different SOS messages and placed the incident in a different location. The evolution of the story over time has led some researchers to conclude that it might be an urban legend rather than a factual account. However, the fact that the story appeared in multiple newspapers and was reported by apparently credible sources suggests that something real might have inspired it. Even if the details have been embellished over time, there might be a kernel of truth to the Ourang Medan incident. The Silver Star, mentioned as one of the rescue vessels, was a real ship that operated in the Pacific during the 1940s. However, by 1947 the vessel had been renamed the SS Santa Cecilia, casting doubt on whether it was actually involved in the incident as described. The story of the Ourang Medan has become part of maritime folklore, often cited as evidence of supernatural forces at sea. Some believers in the paranormal suggest that the crew encountered something beyond human understanding, possibly extraterrestrial beings, interdimensional entities, or other supernatural forces. More scientific explanations focus on unusual weather phenomena or geological activity. The Strait of Malacca is known for its unpredictable conditions, and some researchers have suggested that the ship might have encountered a rare atmospheric or oceanic phenomenon that could have caused the deaths. Infrasound, sound waves below the range of human hearing, has been suggested as a possible explanation. Certain frequencies of infrasound can cause feelings of unease, panic, and even physical symptoms in humans and animals. If the ship encountered a natural source of infrasound, it might explain the crew's apparent terror. Methane gas released from the ocean floor is another possibility. Large bubbles of methane can cause ships to lose buoyancy and sink rapidly. If the Ourang Medan encountered such a phenomenon, it might explain both the crew's deaths and the ship's eventual fate. The incident has been featured in numerous books, documentaries, and television programs about maritime mysteries. It's often grouped with other unexplained disappearances and incidents at sea, contributing to the mystique of the ocean as a place where normal rules don't apply. Modern investigators continue to search for evidence of the Ourang Medan. Advances in underwater archaeology and deep-sea exploration have made it possible to locate and examine shipwrecks that would have been inaccessible in the 1940s. However, the exact location where the ship allegedly sank remains unknown, making any search extremely difficult. The story has also attracted the attention of conspiracy theorists, who suggest that government agencies covered up the incident to hide evidence of secret weapons testing or other classified activities. Some claim that the crew of the Ourang Medan was killed by experimental weapons being tested by various military forces in the post-war period. The timing of the incident, just 2 years after the end of World War II, has led to speculation about connections to Nazi Germany's secret weapons programs. Some researchers have suggested that the ship might have been carrying materials or personnel related to these programs, possibly explaining why it doesn't appear in official records. The location of the incident in the Strait of Malacca, a strategically important waterway, has also fueled theories about espionage and international intrigue. The strait was a crucial shipping route during the Cold War, and various intelligence agencies were active in the region. Despite decades of investigation and speculation, the truth about the Ourang Medan remains elusive. The story has become a modern maritime legend, passed down through generations of sailors and maritime enthusiasts. Whether it's based on a real incident or is entirely fictional, it continues to capture the imagination of those fascinated by the mysteries of the sea. The lack of definitive evidence hasn't stopped new theories from emerging. Some researchers continue to search archives and maritime records, hoping to find some trace of the mysterious vessel. Others focus on examining similar incidents, looking for patterns that might explain what happened to the Ourang Medan's crew. The MV Joyita, October 3rd, 1955. The sun is just beginning to rise over the harbour at Apia, Samoa, casting long shadows across the waters of the South Pacific. At the dock here, a 69-foot wooden vessel named MV Joyita is preparing for what should be a routine voyage. The ship has seen better days, her hull is weathered, her paint is peeling, and her engines are temperamental. But Captain Thomas Dusty Miller, a British-born sailor with years of experience in Pacific waters, believes she's seaworthy enough for the 270-mile journey to the Tokelau Islands. The Joyita wasn't always a working boat. Built in 1931 as a luxury yacht in Los Angeles, she was originally owned by movie director Roland West, who named her after his wife, actress Jewel Carmen. The name means Little Jewel in Spanish, and in her early days she lived up to that name. She was a beautiful vessel with a cedar hull built on oak frames, designed for comfort and style rather than cargo hauling. During World War II, the US Navy took over the Joyita and converted her into a patrol boat. She served in Hawaiian waters until 1946, when the Navy declared her surplus and sold her to civilian owners. By 1955, she had changed hands several times and was being used as a trading vessel in the South Pacific. Her luxury fittings had been replaced with cargo space, and cork lining had been added to her hull to help her carry refrigerated goods. Captain Miller has been chartering the Joyita for several years, using her to carry supplies and passengers between the various islands of the South Pacific. He's a skilled sailor, but he's also a man under pressure. His recent fishing ventures have been unsuccessful, and he's accumulated significant debts. The regular government charters between Samoa and Tokelau are his main source of income, and he needs this trip to go smoothly. The Joyita was supposed to leave Apia on October 2nd, but there's been a delay. The port engine's clutch has failed and repairs have taken longer than expected. Miller makes a decision that will later be criticised by investigators. He chooses to make the voyage on just one engine rather than wait for proper repairs. With 25 people depending on him to get to Tokelau, and with his own financial situation getting worse, he can't afford to postpone the trip any longer. The passenger manifest reads like a cross-section of South Pacific life. There's Dr. Alfred Andy Parsons, a World War II surgeon who's travelling to perform an emergency amputation. Roger Perlis, a New Zealand district officer, is making his regular rounds of the islands. There's also a pharmacist named Bert Hodgkinson, a copra buyer, and several local families including 2 young children. The crew consists of 16 men, a mix of experienced sailors and local workers. At 5 a.m, the Joyita finally leaves Apia Harbour. The sea is calm and the weather looks good for the voyage. Under normal conditions, the trip to Tokelau would take 41 to 48 hours, but the Joyita is travelling on only one engine, which means she'll be slower than usual and consuming more fuel. Miller calculates that they should still have enough fuel to reach their destination, but there's little room for error. For the first day, everything seems to go according to plan. The Joyita makes steady progress across the Pacific, her single engine chugging along reliably. The passengers settle into the routine of the voyage, and the crew goes about their usual duties. No one suspects that within hours all 25 people aboard will vanish without a trace. The first sign of trouble comes when the Joyita fails to arrive at her scheduled destination. On October 6th, 3 days after she left Apia, the port authorities at Whakaofo in the Tokelau Islands report that the ship is overdue. This isn't unusual in itself. Ships are often delayed by weather or mechanical problems. But as the hours pass with no word from the Joyita, concern grows. No distress signal has been received by any radio operator, either on land or at sea. The Joyita carries radio equipment, but it's in poor condition. Unknown to the passengers and crew, the radio's range is limited to about 2 miles because of faulty wiring. Even if they had tried to send a distress call, it's unlikely anyone would have heard it. On October 6th, the Royal New Zealand Air Force launches a massive search operation. Sunderland flying boats take off from bases across the Pacific, covering an area of nearly 100,000 square miles. The search continues for 6 days, with aircraft flying grid patterns over the ocean, looking for any sign of the missing vessel. They find nothing. No wreckage, no life rafts, no trace of the 25 people who were aboard. The search is called off on October 12th, and the Joyita is presumed lost with all hands. The families of the passengers and crew begin to mourn their loved ones, accepting that they've been claimed by the unforgiving Pacific Ocean. But the story of the Joyita is far from over. 5 weeks later, on November 10th, 1955, Captain Gerald Douglas of the merchant ship Tuvalu is making his way from Suva to Funafuti when he spots something unusual on the horizon. It's a partially submerged vessel, listing heavily to one side, drifting aimlessly in the waters north of Vanuatu. As he gets closer, Douglas realises he's looking at the missing Joyita. The sight that greets the crew of the Tuvalu is both puzzling and disturbing. The Joyita is floating, but she's sitting low in the water with her port deck rail completely submerged. Her flying bridge has been smashed away, and there's damage to her superstructure. But most unsettling of all is the complete absence of any human life. The ship is empty, drifting like a ghost across the Pacific. Douglas orders a boarding party to investigate the derelict vessel. What they find raises more questions than answers. The Joyita's radio is tuned to 2182 kHz, the International Marine Distress Frequency, suggesting that someone had been trying to call for help. But there's no sign of what happened to the 25 people who were aboard when she left Apia. The boarding party discovers that several items are missing from the ship. The Joyita's lifeboat and 3 life rafts are gone, along with the ship's logbook, navigational instruments, and firearms that Captain Miller kept on board. 4 tons of cargo have also vanished. A doctor's bag is found on deck containing a stethoscope, a scalpel, and 4 lengths of blood-stained bandages. The ship's clocks, which were powered by the generator, have stopped at 10:25. The switches for the cabin lights and navigation lights are in the on position, indicating that whatever happened occurred during the night. The port engine, which had been giving trouble, is still partially disassembled, confirming that the Joyita had been travelling on only one engine. Most puzzling of all is the condition of the ship itself. Despite being partially flooded, the Joyita is structurally sound. Her hull is intact, and once the water is pumped out, she floats normally. The cork lining that was added to her cargo holds makes her virtually unsinkable. This raises the crucial question that will haunt investigators for decades. Why did 25 people abandon a floating ship for small life rafts in the middle of the Pacific Ocean? The Joyita is towed to Suva, where a formal investigation begins. When investigators examine the ship more closely, they discover the cause of the flooding. A pipe in the cooling system of the port auxiliary engine has failed due to galvanic corrosion, allowing seawater to enter the bilge. The ship's bilge pumps have become clogged with debris, making it impossible to pump out the water. The investigation reveals that the Joyita began taking on water sometime during the night of October the 4th. 5, probably around 9 p.m. As the water level rose, the ship would have developed a list and become difficult to steer. With only one engine working, Captain Miller would have been unable to maintain enough speed to keep the ship stable in heavy seas. But this still doesn't explain why everyone abandoned ship. The official inquiry held in Apia in February 1956 concludes that the fate of the passengers and crew is inexplicable on the evidence submitted. The investigators understand what caused the ship to flood, but they can't explain why 25 people chose to leave a floating vessel for the uncertain safety of life rafts. Several theories emerged to explain the disappearance. The most straightforward suggests that Captain Miller died or became incapacitated, possibly from a heart attack or accident. The blood-stained bandages found on deck support this theory. Without Miller to reassure them that the ship was unsinkable, the passengers and crew may have panicked when the Joyita began to list and decided to abandon ship. Another theory focuses on the tension between Miller and his first mate, Chuck Simpson. Simpson was an American who'd been critical of Miller's decision to sail with only one engine. Some investigators believe that as the ship began to flood, Simpson may have led a mutiny, demanding that Miller turn back to Samoa. In the struggle that followed, Miller may have been injured or killed, and Simpson may have decided to abandon the ship with the passengers and crew. The mutiny theory is supported by the fact that the ship's guns are missing, along with the navigational equipment and logbook. If Simpson had taken control of the vessel, he would have wanted to remove these items. The theory suggests that Simpson led the passengers and crew to what he thought was a nearby island, but the life rafts were caught in strong currents and swept out to sea. More sinister theories involve pirates or hostile forces. In 1955, there were still remnants of Japanese military units operating in remote areas of the Pacific. Some investigators speculated that the Joyita had encountered a group of these holdouts who killed the passengers and crew and stole the cargo. The missing Japanese knives found on the ship during the investigation initially supported this theory, but the knives turned out to be old and unrelated to the disappearance. The Cold War context of the 1950s led to speculation about Soviet involvement. Some theorists suggested that the Joyita's passengers and crew were captured by a Soviet submarine, possibly as part of an intelligence operation. The fact that the ship was found far from her intended route supported theories about external intervention. More conventional explanations focus on the challenges of navigation in 1955. Without modern GPS or satellite communication, ships relied on celestial navigation and radio beacons. If the Joyita had drifted off course while flooded, the crew might have mistaken distant islands for their destination and attempted to reach them in the life rafts. The investigation into the Joyita's disappearance reveals the poor condition of the vessel and the questionable decision-making of Captain Miller. The ship was overcrowded, with 25 people aboard a vessel designed for far fewer. The radio equipment was faulty, the bilge pumps were inadequate, and there weren't enough life jackets for everyone on board. Miller's decision to sail with only one working engine was criticised as reckless, but even accounting for these problems, the disappearance remains puzzling. Experienced sailors like Miller would have known that the Joyita was virtually unsinkable. The cork lining and cargo of empty fuel drums provided enormous buoyancy. Even if the ship had been completely flooded, she would have remained afloat. Why would Miller have ordered everyone to abandon ship? The case becomes even more mysterious when investigators examine the ship's location when she was found. The Joyita was discovered more than 600 miles from her intended route, drifting in waters where she had no business being. How did she get so far off course? The fuel remaining in her tank suggested that she'd travelled about 243 miles before being abandoned, probably within 50 miles of Tokelau. So how did she end up hundreds of miles away? One possibility is that the Joyita continued to drift for weeks after being abandoned, carried by currents and winds across the Pacific. But this doesn't explain the extensive damage to her superstructure, which appears to have been caused by heavy seas rather than abandonment. The ship may have encountered severe weather after being abandoned, which could account for both the damage and her change of position. The human element of the tragedy becomes clear when investigators examine the passenger and crew manifest. Dr. Parsons was travelling to perform life-saving surgery on a patient in Tokelau. His disappearance meant that someone else may have died for lack of medical care. District Officer Perlis was responsible for the administration of the islands, and his disappearance disrupted government services. The local families were simply trying to travel between islands, a routine part of life in the Pacific. The disappearance of the Joyita had a lasting impact on maritime safety in the South Pacific. New regulations were implemented requiring better radio equipment, more life rafts, and stricter inspections of passenger vessels. The tragedy highlighted the dangers of operating marginal vessels in remote waters where rescue is difficult or impossible. In subsequent years, various authors and investigators have proposed new theories about the Joyita's fate. British author Robin Moorham, who later owned the ship, spent years investigating the case and published his findings in 1962. He concluded that a combination of mechanical failure, bad weather, and poor decision-making led to the disaster, with mutiny playing a role in the final tragedy. The Joyita herself survived the mystery that made her famous. After the investigation, she was sold at auction and continued to operate in Pacific waters for several more years. But she seemed to be cursed with bad luck, running aground multiple times and experiencing various accidents. She was eventually abandoned and broke up in the 1970s, finally succumbing to the elements that had claimed her passengers and crew 2 decades earlier. The case of the MV Joyita remains one of the most puzzling maritime mysteries of the 20th century. Unlike many disappearances at sea, investigators had physical evidence to examine, the ship herself, with all her clues and contradictions. But even with this evidence, they couldn't definitively explain what happened to the 25 people who vanished somewhere in the vastness of the Pacific. The story serves as a reminder of how quickly things can go wrong at sea, even on routine voyages. The combination of mechanical failure, questionable decision-making, and the isolation of the Pacific Ocean created a perfect storm of circumstances that led to tragedy. The fact that the ship survived while all her people disappeared makes the case even more haunting, a floating testament to the sea's ability to claim lives while leaving behind only questions. Modern maritime safety equipment, satellite communication, GPS navigation, and emergency beacons would have made the Joyita's fate far less likely today. But in 1955, ships venturing into remote waters were truly on their own, dependent on the skill of their crews and the mercy of the sea. For the 25 people aboard the Joyita, that mercy was not forthcoming, and their fate remains one of the ocean's most enduring secrets, the Dyatlov Pass incident. On February 1st of 1959, in the vast wilderness of the northern Ural Mountains, 9 experienced Soviet hikers are making their way across a barren landscape that stretches endlessly under grey winter skies. The group is led by Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old engineering student who has earned a reputation as one of the most skilled mountaineers at the Ural Polytechnic Institute. What happens to these 9 people over the next 24 hours will become one of the most puzzling mysteries of the 20th century. The group consists of 7 men and 2 women, all in their early 20s except for one. Most are students from the Ural Polytechnic Institute in Sverdlovsk, now called Yekaterinburg. They're not novices. These are seasoned hikers who have completed numerous challenging expeditions in the harsh Russian wilderness. Their goal is ambitious, to reach Mount Otorten, a peak in the northern Urals that no one has climbed in winter. The name Otorten means "don't go there" in the local Mansi language, but the group is confident in their abilities. Igor Dyatlov has planned this expedition meticulously. At 23, he's already a veteran of multiple Category 3 hiking expeditions, the most difficult classification in the Soviet hiking system. He's known for his calm leadership and technical expertise. The other members of his group are equally experienced. Zinaida Kolmogorova, 22, is one of 2 women in the group and an accomplished hiker who has completed several difficult expeditions. Rustem Slobodin, 23, is studying engineering and has extensive mountain experience. The group also includes Yuri Doroshenko, 21, who recently turned 21 during the expedition and is studying radio engineering. Yuri Krivonishenko, 23, works at a secret nuclear facility called Mayak and is an experienced outdoorsman. The 5th man is Alexander Kolevatov, 24, who is studying physics and has extensive hiking experience. The 2nd woman is Lyudmila Dubinina, 20, an economics student known for her energy and enthusiasm for the outdoors. 2 additional members round out the group. Nikolai Thibault Brignol, 23, is studying engineering and has completed multiple challenging expeditions. His great-grandfather was French, which explains his unusual surname. The oldest member of the group is Semyon Zolotaryov, 38, a World War II veteran and sports instructor who joined the expedition at the last minute. His presence puzzles some researchers because he was much older than the students and wasn't part of their regular hiking circle. The expedition was supposed to include a 10th member, Yuri Yudin, but he became ill with sciatica and turned back early in the trip. This decision almost certainly saved his life. Yudin would spend the rest of his life wondering what happened to his friends and feeling guilty that he survived when they didn't. The group began their journey on January 23rd, taking a train from Sverdlovsk to the town of Ivdel. From there, they travelled by truck to a logging camp and then used skis to make their way into the wilderness. Their plan was to establish a base camp, cache some supplies, and then push on to Mount Otorten. The expedition was rated Category 3, the highest difficulty level, but all the members were qualified for such challenging trips. For the first week, everything went according to plan. The group maintained a daily diary, documenting their progress and taking photographs. The entries show that morale was good and they were making steady progress despite difficult weather conditions. They established their supply cache as planned and began the final push towards Mount Otorten. On February 1st, 1959, the group decided to camp on the slopes of a mountain called Kholat Syakhl, which means Dead Mountain in the Mansi language. This was not their original plan. They had intended to camp in the forest below, where they would have been protected from the wind. But Igor Dyatlov made a decision that would later be heavily criticised. He chose to pitch their tent on the exposed slope of the mountain, about 1,500 feet below the summit. The reasons for this decision remain unclear. Some investigators believe Dyatlov wanted to gain experience camping in difficult conditions. Others suggest that the group was running behind schedule, and Dyatlov didn't want to lose time by hiking down to the forest. Still others propose that something forced them to camp in this exposed location. The tent they set up was a custom design that Igor Dyatlov had created by sewing 2 smaller tents together. It was large enough to accommodate all 9 hikers, but it was not designed for the extreme conditions they faced on the mountainside. The temperature that night was around -25 degrees Fahrenheit, with strong winds that would have made the wind chill much more severe. What happened next has been debated for more than 60 years. Sometime during the night of February 1st, all 9 members of the group died under circumstances that have never been satisfactorily explained. When search teams found their bodies weeks later, the scene was so bizarre and inexplicable that it immediately spawned theories ranging from avalanches to military accidents to supernatural phenomena. The first sign that something was wrong came when the group failed to return as scheduled. They were supposed to send a telegram from the town of Vizay by February 12th, but the date came and went with no word from the expedition. Initially, this didn't cause alarm, Hiking groups often returned late due to weather or other delays. But as days passed with no communication, concern grew among the families and the hiking club at the Institute. On February 20th, search teams were finally organised. The search was massive by Soviet standards, involving hundreds of people including students, military personnel, police and local indigenous people called the Mansi. Search planes flew over the area, and ground teams combed the forest and mountains, looking for any sign of the missing hikers. On February 26th, searchers found the group's tent on the slope of Kholat Syakhl. What they discovered there defied explanation. The tent had been cut open from the inside, with long slashes that would have allowed the occupants to escape quickly. But why would experienced hikers cut their way out of their own tent in the middle of a winter night in sub-zero temperatures? Inside the tent, searchers found the group's belongings largely undisturbed. Food was laid out as if they had been preparing to eat. The hikers' boots and heavy clothing were still inside the tent, suggesting that they had left in a hurry wearing only their sleeping clothes. There were no signs of a struggle, no evidence of an attack, and no indication of what could have caused 9 experienced hikers to flee their shelter into the deadly cold. Following footprints in the snow, searchers found that the group had walked about a mile down the slope toward a large cedar tree at the edge of the forest. The footprints showed that they had walked in an orderly fashion, not running in panic. Some of the prints appeared to be from bare or sock-covered feet, confirming that the hikers had left their tent without proper footwear. The first 2 bodies were found under the cedar tree. Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonyshenko were discovered lying in their underwear, barefoot in the snow. Around them were the remains of a small fire, and branches had been broken from the cedar tree up to a height of 15 feet, suggesting that someone had climbed the tree. Both men had died from hypothermia, but Krivonyshenko had burns on his hands and a piece of flesh bitten off from his own knuckle. Over the following days, searchers found 3 more bodies. Igor Dyatlov was discovered about 300 meters from the cedar tree, positioned as if he had been trying to return to the tent. Zenaida Kolmogorova was found about 630 meters from the tree, also positioned as if heading back toward the tent. Rustem Slobodin was found between the other 2, about 480 meters from the cedar. All 3 had died from hypothermia, but Slobodin had a fractured skull and facial injuries that suggested he had been struck by something or had fallen. These 5 deaths could potentially be explained by exposure to the cold, though the circumstances remained mysterious. But it would be 3 months before the full horror of the incident was revealed. In May 1959, after the snow had melted, searchers found the remaining 4 bodies in a ravine about 75 meters from the cedar tree. These discoveries would make the mystery even more baffling. The 4 bodies found in the ravine, Lyudmila Dubinina, Semyon Zolotaryov, Alexander Kolevatov, and Nikolai Thibault Brignol, had died from causes that couldn't be explained by exposure. 3 of them had massive internal injuries that would have been fatal. Dubinina and Zolotaryov had severe chest fractures with multiple broken ribs. Thibault Brignol had a major skull fracture that had driven bone fragments into his brain. The injuries were particularly puzzling because they showed no external damage. The force required to cause such internal trauma would have been enormous, equivalent to a high-speed car crash. Yet there were no cuts, bruises or other signs of external violence. A medical examiner compared the injuries to those that might be caused by a car moving at high speed. Even more disturbing were other aspects of the scene. Dubinina was found with her tongue and eyes missing. Zolotaryov was also missing his eyes. Some researchers have suggested that these soft tissues were eaten by scavengers, but others point out that the bodies were frozen solid and buried under snow, making access by animals unlikely. The clothing found on the bodies raised additional questions. Several of the hikers were wearing items that belonged to other members of the group, suggesting that the survivors had tried to keep warm by taking clothes from those who had already died. Some pieces of clothing tested positive for radiation, though the levels were not necessarily dangerous. The Soviet authorities conducted an official investigation, but it was closed after just a few months with an inconclusive finding. The official report stated that the hikers had died from a compelling natural force that they were unable to overcome. This vague conclusion satisfied no one and immediately sparked speculation about cover-ups and hidden truths. Over the decades, numerous theories have been proposed to explain what happened to the Dyatlov group. The avalanche theory suggests that a sudden snowslide forced the hikers to cut their way out of the tent and flee to safety, but this doesn't explain the severe internal injuries or why no evidence of an avalanche was found at the tent site. The military accident theory proposes that the group witnessed or was caught in secret weapons testing. The Soviet Union was conducting missile tests in the region, and some witnesses reported seeing strange lights in the sky around the time of the incident. This could explain the radiation found on some clothing and the severe injuries, but there's no direct evidence of military involvement. Other theories include attacks by the local Mansi people, though they had no history of violence against hikers, and several Mansi actually participated in the search. Some have suggested that the group was killed by escaped prisoners from nearby labour camps, but again, there's no evidence to support this idea. More exotic theories involve everything from Yeti attacks to UFO encounters to secret Soviet experiments with infrasound weapons. While these theories capture public imagination, they lack credible evidence and often ignore the basic facts of the case. Recent scientific research has focused on natural explanations for the incident. In 2021, researchers from Switzerland published a study suggesting that a rare type of avalanche called a slab avalanche could have occurred despite the apparently safe location of the tent. Their computer modelling showed that such an event was possible and could have caused the hikers to flee their tent in panic. The slab avalanche theory gained support from Russian investigators who reopened the case in 2019. They concluded that a delayed avalanche had occurred, forcing the hikers to evacuate their tent quickly. According to this theory, the group went to the forest to wait for the danger to pass, but became separated in the dark and cold. The severe injuries to 4 of the hikers were caused when a snow shelter they had built collapsed on them. However, this explanation still doesn't satisfy many researchers and family members of the victims. Critics point out that no clear evidence of an avalanche was found at the tent site, and the theory doesn't explain all aspects of the case, such as the radiation or the missing eyes and tongue. The behaviour of the hikers themselves remains one of the most puzzling aspects of the case. These were experienced mountaineers who understood the deadly nature of the cold. Why would they leave their tent in such a way that they couldn't return to it? Even if they were forced to evacuate quickly, why didn't they try to recover their boots and warm clothing once the immediate danger had passed? Some researchers have suggested that the group experienced a psychological breakdown, possibly caused by carbon monoxide poisoning from their stove or other factors. This could explain their apparently irrational behaviour, but it doesn't account for the severe physical injuries found on some of the bodies. The tent itself provides important clues. It was cut from the inside in several places, suggesting a deliberate attempt to create emergency exits, but the cuts were made with a knife, not torn in panic, suggesting that whoever made them had time to think about what they were doing. This contradicts the idea of a sudden emergency that required immediate evacuation. The footprints leading away from the tent also raise questions. They showed that the group walked calmly down the slope, not running in terror. Some prints appeared to be from people wearing only socks or bare feet, but they walked in an orderly fashion for nearly a mile. This suggests that whatever made them leave the tent wasn't an immediate physical threat. The fire under the cedar tree indicates that the group tried to stay warm and survive. Someone had climbed high into the tree, possibly to see the tent or to look for rescuers. The fact that they were able to start a fire shows that they weren't completely panicked or incapacitated. Yet they apparently made no attempt to return to the tent to retrieve warm clothing or shelter. Weather conditions that night were harsh but not unprecedented for experienced winter hikers. The temperature was around -25 degrees Fahrenheit with strong winds, creating dangerous wind chill conditions. However, the group had camping experience in similar conditions and should have been able to survive in their tent. The timeline of events remains unclear. The group's last diary entry was made on February 1st, and a photograph found in one of their cameras appears to show them setting up the tent that evening. But exactly when they died and in what order is unknown. The condition of the bodies suggests that some died hours after others, indicating that the incident unfolded over an extended period. The radiation found on some clothing has been explained by the fact that one of the hikers, Krivonyshenko, worked at the Mayak nuclear facility, which had experienced a serious accident in 1957. His work clothes could have been contaminated, and other members of the group might have borrowed his clothing. However, this explanation doesn't satisfy everyone, and some researchers continue to see the radiation as evidence of a military or nuclear accident. The missing soft tissues from some bodies remain unexplained. While scavengers could theoretically have eaten these parts, the bodies were found frozen solid under several feet of snow. Most animals would not have been active in winter, and those that were would have difficulty accessing bodies buried so deeply. The ages and experience levels of the group members also raise questions. These weren't reckless young people on their first adventure. They were seasoned hikers with extensive mountain experience. Igor Dyatlov had led multiple difficult expeditions. Several group members had completed Category 3 hikes, the most challenging rating in the Soviet system. They knew how to survive in winter conditions and understood the deadly nature of the environment. The decision to include Semyon Zolotaryov in the group has puzzled some researchers. He was much older than the students and wasn't part of their regular hiking circle. He joined the expedition at the last minute, replacing another hiker who had to drop out. Some conspiracy theorists have suggested that Zolotaryov had a hidden agenda or was placed in the group by authorities, but there's no evidence to support these ideas. Modern technology has brought new tools to the investigation, but it has also raised new questions. Computer modelling of weather conditions and avalanche possibilities has provided some support for natural explanations, but it hasn't definitively solved the mystery. Advanced forensic techniques applied to photographs and physical evidence have revealed new details, but they haven't provided clear answers about what killed the hikers. The Dyatlov Pass incident has become one of the most studied mysteries of the modern era. Hundreds of books, documentaries, and research papers have been written about the case. Multiple expeditions have been mounted to recreate the hiker's journey and test various theories. The internet has allowed researchers around the world to collaborate and share information, but it has also spawned countless unfounded conspiracy theories. The families of the victims have lived with unanswered questions for more than 6 decades. Yuri Yudin, the survivor who turned back early in the trip, spent his entire life trying to understand what happened to his friends. He died in 2013, still without answers. Other family members continue to push for new investigations and refuse to accept official explanations that they believe are incomplete. The case has had a lasting impact on Russian popular culture and continues to fascinate people around the world. The phrase Dyatlov Pass has become synonymous with unsolved mysteries and unexplained deaths. The incident has inspired movies, television shows, video games, and countless works of fiction. The mountain where the hikers died has been renamed Dyatlov Pass in their honour, and a memorial plaque marks the general area where the tragedy occurred. The site has become a destination for adventurous hikers and mystery enthusiasts, though the harsh conditions and remote location make it accessible only to experienced mountaineers. Despite decades of investigation by professional researchers, amateur sleuths, and government authorities, the Dyatlov Pass incident remains unsolved. Each theory that emerges seems to explain some aspects of the case while leaving others unexplained. The combination of physical evidence, witness testimony, and official documents creates a puzzle with too many missing pieces. The 9th Roman Legion, 108 AD. On the windswept moors of northern Britain, 5,000 Roman soldiers are going about their daily routines in the fortress city of Eboracum, what we now call York. The Legio in Hispana, the 9th Spanish Legion, has been stationed in Britain for over 60 years. These are not fresh recruits, they are battle-hardened professionals who have fought in some of the most challenging campaigns of the Roman Empire. Their bronze eagle standard gleams in the pale British sun as it stands proudly above their headquarters. None of these soldiers know that they are about to vanish from history itself. The 9th Legion has an impressive military record stretching back over 150 years. They began their service under Julius Caesar himself, fighting in the conquest of Gaul between 58 and 50 BC. Caesar trusted them enough to include them in his most dangerous campaigns, and they proved themselves worthy of that trust. They fought at the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BC, where Caesar defeated Pompey and secured his position as the most powerful man in Rome. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon and marched on Rome, the 9th Legion marched with him. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BC, the Legion continued to serve the Roman state. They fought for Octavian, later known as Augustus, in the civil wars that followed Caesar's death. At the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, they helped secure Augustus's victory over Mark Antony and Cleopatra, effectively ending the Roman Republic and beginning the Roman Empire. For their service, they were rewarded with campaigns in Spain, where they earned their nickname Hispana, the Spanish Legion. The Legion's arrival in Britain came during the invasion of 43 AD, when Emperor Claudius decided to conquer the mysterious island beyond the Channel. The 9th Legion was among the 4 legions that crossed the waters and established Roman rule in southern Britain. They quickly proved their worth, helping to defeat the British King Caratacus in 50 AD and establishing a fort at what would become Lincoln. But the legion's reputation was nearly destroyed in 61 AD during the rebellion of Queen Boudica. The warrior queen of the Iceni tribe had risen against Roman rule, and her forces were sweeping across eastern Britain, burning Roman towns and killing colonists. The 9th Legion, under the command of Quintus Petilius Cerialis, marched to relieve the besieged city of Camulodunum, modern Colchester. What happened next was one of the worst defeats in Roman military history. Boudica's forces surrounded the legion and slaughtered most of the infantry. Only the cavalry managed to escape, fleeing back to their fortress while leaving thousands of their comrades dead on the battlefield. The disaster was so complete that the legion had to be rebuilt with reinforcements from Germany. The shame of that defeat haunted the 9th Legion for years, and they were determined to restore their honour. They got their chance 10 years later when Cerialis returned as governor of Britain. This time, leading the rebuilt 9th Legion, he launched a successful campaign against the Brigantes tribe in northern Britain. The legion fought with skill and determination, winning battle after battle and pushing the frontier northward. They established a new fortress at Eboracum in 71 AD, which became their permanent base in Britain. The 9th Legion's finest hour came during the campaigns of Agricola in the 80s AD. They participated in the invasion of Caledonia, modern Scotland, pushing deeper into the highland wilderness than any Roman force had gone before. At the Battle of Mons Graupius in 83 AD, they helped win a decisive victory over the Caledonian tribes, with Agricola reporting that 10,000 Bretons were killed, while only 360 Romans died. But the campaign in Caledonia also nearly destroyed the legion. According to the historian Tacitus, the 9th Legion was almost wiped out in a surprise night attack by Caledonian warriors. The enemy burst upon them as they were terrified in their sleep, and only the arrival of Roman cavalry prevented a complete massacre. The experience showed the dangers of fighting in the remote highlands, where every tree and hill could hide an enemy. After the Caledonian campaign, the 9th Legion settled into routine garrison duty at Eboracum. They built roads, collected taxes, and maintained peace in northern Britain. The last definite record of their presence comes from 108 AD, when they completed the rebuilding of their fortress in stone. An inscribed tablet found in 1864 records this achievement. The Emperor Caesar, son of the divine Nerva, Nerva Traianus Augustus, Germanicus, Dassicus, Pontifex Maximus, in his 12th year of tribunician power, 5 times acclaimed imperator, 5 times consul, father of his country, made this gateway by agency of the 9th Legion Hispana. This inscription, now displayed in the Yorkshire Museum in York, represents the last certain trace of the 9th Legion. After 108 AD, they simply disappear from the historical record. No battles are recorded, no movements are documented, no honours are awarded. 5,000 of Rome's finest soldiers vanish as completely as if they had never existed. The mystery deepens when we examine what was happening in Britain during this period. The early years of the 2nd century were marked by serious troubles on the frontier. The Roman writer Fronto, writing in the 160 AD, told Emperor Marcus Aurelius that during the reign of Hadrian, large numbers of Roman soldiers were killed by the British. The anonymous author of the Augustan history, compiled in the 3rd century, provides more detail, noting that when Hadrian became emperor in 117 AD, the Britons could not be kept under Roman control. These sources suggest that Britain was in chaos during the years following 108 AD. There were rebellions, attacks on Roman installations, and significant military losses. The situation was serious enough that Emperor Hadrian himself visited Britain in 122 AD, bringing with him a completely new legion, the 6th Victrix, to replace the missing 9th. The new legion took over the fortress at Eboracum, suggesting that the 9th's absence was permanent. The most obvious explanation for the disappearance is that the 9th Legion was destroyed in battle against British tribes. The eminent 19th century German historian Theodor Mommsen proposed that under Hadrian there was a terrible catastrophe here, apparently an attack on the fortress of Eboracum and the annihilation of the legion stationed there. He suggested that a revolt of the Brigantes tribe soon after 108 AD was the most likely cause. This theory gained popular support through Rosemary Sutcliffe's 1954 novel The Eagle of the Ninth, which depicted the Legion marching into the Scottish Highlands and never returning. The book became a bestseller and was adapted for television and film, cementing the idea that the Ninth Legion was destroyed by Celtic warriors in the mists of Caledonia. The image of Roman soldiers disappearing into the Highland wilderness has powerful appeal. It represents the ultimate victory of the underdog. British warriors armed with spears and shields defeating the most professional army in the world. For the English, it's an inspiring tale of resistance against foreign invasion. For the Scots, it's a symbol of their ancestors' refusal to bow to Roman rule. But modern historians have found problems with this romantic theory. In the 1980s and 1990s, archaeologists discovered evidence that elements of the Ninth Legion were stationed at Nijmegen in the Netherlands sometime after 108 AD. Tile stamps bearing the Legion's mark were found dating to between 104 and 120 AD. Most significantly, a silver-plated bronze pendant was discovered that was part of a military decoration, with Leg Hispi 9 inscribed on the reverse. These discoveries suggest that at least part of the Ninth Legion survived whatever happened in Britain and was transferred to the Rhine frontier. An altar to Apollo found near Aachen, Germany, was erected by Lucius Latinius Macer, who describes himself as the chief centurion and third in command of the Ninth Legion. This indicates that senior officers of the Legion were alive and serving well after 108 AD. The evidence from the Netherlands has led some historians to propose alternative theories for the Legion's disappearance. One possibility is that the Ninth Legion was destroyed during the Second Jewish Revolt against Rome in 135 AD. This rebellion, led by Simon Bar Kokhba, was one of the bloodiest conflicts in Roman history. The Romans suffered heavy casualties, and several units may have been completely destroyed. Another theory suggests that the Legion was wiped out during Emperor Marcus Aurelius's Parthian War between 161 and 166 AD. The Greek historian Cassius Dio records that a Roman legion was surrounded and annihilated by Parthian forces in Armenia, leading to the suicide of its commander. Since the two legions normally stationed in the region survived beyond 200 AD, some historians propose that the destroyed legion was the ninth. A third possibility is that the legion was disbanded for reasons that are no longer recorded. Roman legions could be dissolved for various reasons: military defeats, mutiny, or simply administrative reorganization. The Ninth Legion's disgrace at the hands of Boudicca might have marked them as unreliable in the eyes of later emperors. The debate over the Ninth Legion's fate is complicated by the nature of Roman record-keeping. We know that the legion existed in 108 AD and had ceased to exist by 197 AD, when two independent lists of Roman legions were compiled. Neither list includes the Ninth Legion, indicating that it had been destroyed or disbanded by that time. But the exact date and circumstances of its disappearance remain unknown. Some historians argue that the legion never left Britain at all. Dr. Miles Russell of Bournemouth University has studied the evidence extensively and concludes that there is no evidence that the Ninth were ever taken out of Britain. He argues that the tile stamps found at Nijmegen date to the 80s AD, when detachments of the Ninth were fighting Germanic tribes on the Rhine, not to the period after 108 AD. Russell believes that the legion was destroyed in northern Britain during the troubles of the early 2nd century. He points to the fact that Emperor Hadrian's visit to Britain resulted in the construction of Hadrian's Wall, a massive fortification designed to keep the northern tribes out of Roman territory. The wall, Russell argues, was built in response to a military disaster, the destruction of the Ninth Legion. The construction of Hadrian's Wall certainly represents a major change in Roman strategy. Instead of continuing to advance northward, the Romans decided to establish a permanent defensive line across northern England. This suggests that they had suffered a significant defeat that made further expansion impossible. The loss of an entire legion would certainly explain such a dramatic change in policy. The mystery of the Ninth Legion has had an unexpected impact on British history. If the legion was indeed destroyed by northern tribes, it may have been the event that determined the permanent border between England and Scotland. Hadrian's Wall not only kept the northern tribes out of Roman territory, but also ensured that the cultures on either side of the wall developed separately. The origins of the independent kingdoms of England and Scotland may be traced to the loss of this single Roman legion. The human cost of whatever happened to the 9th Legion was enormous. A Roman legion at full strength contained about 5,400 men, including legionaries, auxiliaries, and support staff. These were not just numbers on a military roster. They were individuals with families, hopes, and dreams. Many had served for decades, working their way up through the ranks. Some had wives and children living in the civilian settlements that grew up around Roman fortresses. The disappearance of the 9th Legion has inspired countless works of fiction, but the reality would have been far more tragic than any novel. Thousands of men simply vanished from history, leaving behind no graves, no monuments, no records of their final moments. Their families would have waited for news that never came, hoping for letters that were never written. Archaeological evidence from the period provides some clues about the troubles in northern Britain. Excavations at various sites have revealed signs of destruction and abandonment dating to the early 2nd century. Roman forts were burned, settlements were abandoned, and defensive works were strengthened. This suggests a period of serious warfare, but it doesn't tell us exactly what happened to the 9th Legion. The lack of definitive evidence has allowed the mystery to persist for nearly 2,000 years. Unlike many historical puzzles, this one cannot be solved by discovering new documents or inscriptions. The Romans were meticulous record keepers, but their records from this period are incomplete. Whatever happened to the 9th Legion occurred in a time and place where detailed documentation was impossible. The debate over the Legion's fate continues to divide historians. Some remain convinced that the unit was destroyed in Britain, possibly during a major rebellion that forced the Romans to build Hadrian's Wall. Others believe that the Legion was transferred to other provinces and met its end in later conflicts. Still others suggest that the Legion was simply disbanded and its members reassigned to other units. Recent archaeological discoveries have added new dimensions to the mystery. In 2019, excavations at the site of a Roman fort in northern England revealed evidence of a major battle dating to the early 2nd century. The discovery included weapons, armour, and human remains that suggest a significant military defeat. While this evidence cannot be definitively linked to the 9th Legion, it supports the theory that Roman forces suffered serious losses in northern Britain during this period. The Bennington Triangle. It's November 12th of 1945, and in the rolling hills of southwestern Vermont, a seasoned outdoorsman named Middy Rivers is preparing for what should be a routine hunting trip. At 74 years old, Rivers has spent decades roaming these woods, and he knows every trail, every hollow, and every landmark in the area around Bennington. His son-in-law operates a hunting camp on the Long Trail, and Rivers has been there countless times. Today he's walking through Bickford Hollow, about 4 miles west of Bennington, carrying his rifle and wearing his familiar hunting clothes. Around 4 p.m, a friend spots Rivers on a nearby trail walking in a direction that seems odd, away from the camp rather than toward it. The friend calls out and waves, but Rivers doesn't respond. He continues walking, disappearing into the thick Vermont woods. It's the last confirmed sighting of Middy Rivers. When he fails to return to camp that evening, his family assumes he's decided to stay out overnight, something he's done before. But when the next day passes with no sign of him, they know something is wrong. The search for Rivers begins immediately. Volunteers from Fort Devens join local searchers, along with members of the Vermont State Guard. They comb through the dense forest, calling his name, checking every ravine and thicket. The search continues through the winter and into the spring of 1946, but Rivers has vanished completely. The only trace ever found is a handkerchief discovered by a hiker the following spring, located south of where Rivers was last seen. The disappearance of Middy Rivers is troubling but not unprecedented. People sometimes get lost in the woods, especially elderly hunters who might suffer heart attacks or other medical emergencies. But Rivers is just the first of 5 people who will disappear in this area over the next 5 years, creating one of New England's most enduring mysteries. December 1st, 1946. Paula Jean Weldon is an 18-year-old sophomore at Bennington College, a prestigious liberal arts school in North Bennington, Vermont. She comes from a well-to-do family in Stamford, Connecticut, and is known as a bright, independent young woman who loves the outdoors. On this Sunday afternoon, she tells her roommate she's going for a hike, a common activity for students at the college. She's wearing a red jacket, blue jeans, and lightweight sneakers, not the kind of clothing you'd wear for a serious mountain hike in early December. Paula leaves campus around 2:30 p.m, walking and hitchhiking the 6 miles to where the Long Trail crosses Route 9. The Long Trail is Vermont's famous hiking path that runs the length of the state, from Massachusetts to Canada. It's a popular destination for college students looking for outdoor exercise and scenic views. Several witnesses see Paula along the way, including a local man who gives her a ride and a newspaper employee who gives her directions. The last confirmed sighting of Paula is around 4 p.m, when she's spotted walking north on the Long Trail. She's alone, carrying no camping gear, and appears to be planning a short afternoon hike. The temperature is dropping, and darkness will fall in just over an hour. For an experienced hiker, this wouldn't be a problem. The trail is well marked, and Paula could easily return to the road before full darkness. But Paula Weldon's never seen again. When Paula fails to attend her Monday morning classes, her roommate alerts the college authorities. Initially, there's hope that she's simply decided to extend her hike and will return soon. But as hours pass with no word from her, the college contacts her parents and the police. What follows is one of the most extensive searches in Vermont history. The search for Paula involves hundreds of volunteers, state police, the FBI, and even aircraft flying over the forested mountains. Her parents offer a $5,000 reward for information leading to her safe return, a substantial sum in 1946. The search continues for weeks, with teams combing every inch of the Long Trail and the surrounding wilderness. They find nothing. No clothing, no footprints, no signs of struggle, no indication of what happened to the young college student. The disappearance of Paula Weldon captures national attention. Here is a bright, attractive young woman from a good family who simply vanished while taking a Sunday afternoon hike. The case is featured in newspapers across the country, and theories range from accidental death to kidnapping to murder. The FBI investigates the possibility that Paula was abducted by someone she knew, but they find no evidence of foul play. The case remains unsolved, but it won't be the last mysterious disappearance in this area. December 1st, 1949. Exactly 3 years to the day after Paula Weldon vanished, another person disappears in the Bennington area. James Tedford is a 68-year-old World War I veteran who lives at the Vermont Soldiers' Home in Bennington. He's been visiting relatives in St. Albans, Vermont, and they accompany him to the bus station, watching him board the southbound bus for the trip home. The bus makes several stops on its way to Bennington, and at the Burlington depot, an acquaintance has a brief conversation with Tedford before he transfers to the final bus that will take him home. The bus driver later reports that a man resembling Tedford might have gotten off in the village of Brandon, about 70 miles north of Bennington. That same night, Brandon police investigate a report of a man fitting Tedford's description acting strangely in the village downtown. What makes Tedford's disappearance particularly strange is that he was scheduled to arrive at the soldiers' home, but he never showed up. His belongings were still on the bus when it reached its final destination, but Tedford himself was gone. The disappearance goes unreported for a full week because the staff at the soldiers' home assume he's simply delayed. When they finally contact police, the trail has gone cold. Tedford's family reveals that he was suffering from mental illness and had been despondent about returning to the soldiers' home. Some investigators theorize that he deliberately left the bus and wandered off, possibly intending to harm himself. But despite extensive searches, no trace of him is ever found. Like the others who disappeared in this area, James Tedford has vanished completely. October 12, 1950. 8-year-old Paul Buddy Jepson is accompanying his mother on routine farm chores. The family keeps a herd of pigs at the Bennington town dump, and Paul's mother needs to tend to the animals. She drives to the dump with Paul around 3 p.m, leaving him in the vehicle while she works with the pigs. The task should take about 30 minutes, and Paul is accustomed to waiting in the car during these trips. When Paul's mother returns to the vehicle around 4 p.m, her son is gone. She searches the immediate area, calling his name, but there's no response. Paul has special needs, which makes his disappearance even more concerning. He's not the type of child who would wander off on his own, and he's familiar with the routine of these trips to the dump. The search for Paul begins immediately. Police and volunteers comb through the dump and surrounding woods, looking for any sign of the missing boy. A bloodhound is brought in to track his scent, and the dog follows a trail from the dump along an adjacent road to an intersection where the scent suddenly disappears. This suggests that Paul may have gotten into a vehicle, either voluntarily or involuntarily. Paul's father speculates that his son might have been accidentally hit by a car, with the driver panicking and taking the boy from the scene. The family also notes that Paul was wearing brown and tan clothing that would have blended in with the fall leaves, making him difficult to spot if he had collapsed in the woods. Despite extensive searches involving aircraft and hundreds of volunteers, Paul Jepson is never found. October 28, 1950. Just 16 days after Paul Jepson's disappearance, another person vanishes in the same general area. Frida Langer is a 53-year-old experienced hiker who has come to the Somerset area with her husband Max and cousin Herbert Elsner. The family owns a cabin on the shores of Somerset Reservoir, and Frida is familiar with the local trails and terrain. On this Saturday morning, Frida and Herbert set out for the hike in the woods near the reservoir. Around 1 p.m, while crossing a stream, Frida slips and falls into the water, soaking her clothes. The October weather is cold and she tells Herbert she's going to take a shortcut back to the cabin to change into dry clothes. She says she'll catch up with him later on the trail. Herbert continues his hike, expecting to meet Frida back at the cabin, but when he returns, she's not there. Max becomes worried as the afternoon progresses with no sign of his wife. Frida suffers from a seizure disorder, and Max fears that exposure to the cold water might have triggered a seizure, causing her to become disoriented and lost in the woods. The search for Frida Langer is massive, involving up to 300 searchers, aircraft and helicopters. They cover every inch of the area where she was last seen, checking every trail, every ravine and every possible hiding place. The search continues for days, but like the others who disappeared in this area, Frida seems to have vanished into thin air. 7 months later, on May 12, 1951, fishermen make a grim discovery. They find Frida's remains on the shore of the eastern branch of the Deerfield River, about 3.5 miles southeast of the family cabin. The location is significant because it's in an area that was only lightly searched during the intensive efforts to find her. The condition of her remains makes it impossible to determine a cause of death, but investigators theorize that she fell down an embankment into a deep pond where she drowned, with her body later washed out by spring flooding. The discovery of Frida's body provides some closure for her family, but it also raises new questions. How did she end up so far from where she was last seen? Why wasn't she found during the extensive search efforts? And why does her fate seem to mirror that of the others who disappeared in this area? By 1950, local journalists and law enforcement are beginning to notice the pattern. 5 people have disappeared in the same general area over a span of 5 years. An elderly hunter, a college student, a war veteran, a special needs child, and an experienced hiker. The disappearances have different circumstances, but they share common elements. The people vanished completely, extensive searches found little or no evidence, and the cases remain unsolved. The Bennington Evening Banner publishes an article in November 1950 suggesting that the region might contain a lost horizon, referencing James Hilton's popular novel about people who become lost in a mystical mountainous area. The article speculates about possible connections between the disappearances and whether there might be something unusual about this particular area of Vermont. The term Bennington Triangle won't be coined until the 1990s, when author Joseph Citro uses it to describe the area where these disappearances occurred. Citro draws parallels between this region and other areas like the Bermuda Triangle, suggesting that certain places might have unusual properties that cause people to vanish. The name catches on, and the Bennington Triangle becomes part of New England folklore. The 5 disappearances have had a lasting impact on the region. Local residents become more cautious about hiking alone in the area, and parents keep closer watch on their children. The cases generate numerous theories about what might have caused so many people to vanish in such a concentrated area and time period. Some investigators focus on the possibility of a serial killer operating in the region. The idea that one person might be responsible for all 5 disappearances is appealing because it provides a single explanation for the pattern. However, the victims are very different ages, genders and backgrounds, and there's no evidence of violence or struggle at any of the scenes. Others suggest that the disappearances might be connected to the area's geography and weather patterns. The region around Glastonbury Mountain is known for its dense forests, rocky terrain and unpredictable weather. It's possible that people became lost or injured in ways that made their bodies impossible to find, even with extensive searches. The timing of the disappearances has also led to speculation about post-war trauma and social upheaval. The 1940s and early 1950s were a time of significant change in American society, with returning veterans struggling to readjust to civilian life and families dealing with the aftermath of World War II. Some researchers wonder if the stress of this period might have contributed to the disappearances. Local folklore adds another dimension to the mystery. The area around Glastonbury Mountain has a long history of strange stories and unexplained phenomena. Native American tribes considered the mountain to be cursed, and early settlers reported unusual experiences in the region. Some people believe that the disappearances are connected to supernatural forces or ancient curses. The role of the media in creating and perpetuating the Bennington Triangle legend cannot be overlooked. Paula Weldon's disappearance, in particular, received extensive newspaper coverage, and the case inspired Shirley Jackson's 1951 novel Hangsaman. The publicity surrounding these cases helped create a sense of mystery and danger around the region that persists today. Modern investigators have applied new techniques to the old cases, but the passage of time makes it difficult to find new evidence. DNA testing, advanced forensic methods, and computer modelling have all been used to re-examine the disappearances, but they haven't provided definitive answers about what happened to the 5 missing people. The case of Paula Weldon remains the most famous and well-documented of the 5 disappearances. Her family never gave up hope that she would be found, and private investigators continue to work on the case for decades. Various theories have been proposed: that she was murdered by someone she knew, that she deliberately disappeared to start a new life, or that she died in an accident and her body was never found. The disappearances have become part of Vermont's cultural identity, appearing in books, documentaries, and tourist attractions. The Long Trail, where Paula Weldon was last seen, now attracts visitors who are curious about the mystery. The area around Glastonbury Mountain has become a destination for people interested in the paranormal and unexplained phenomena. The Yuba County 5. The cold February night in 1978 hangs heavy over the Sierra Nevada mountains, with snowflakes drifting down through the darkness like fragments of a broken sky. In the remote wilderness of Northern California, a silence so deep it seems to press against your eardrums blankets the forest. This is not the comfortable quiet of a peaceful evening. This is the kind of silence that comes when something has gone terribly wrong. 20 miles up a winding mountain road, far from any town or help, a US Forest Service trailer sits locked and empty, its windows dark. Inside, the temperature hovers just above freezing, and the wind outside moans through the pines like a voice trying to tell a story that no one wants to hear. But this trailer will not remain empty for long. In the months to come, it will become the final resting place for one of 5 men who vanished into these mountains after what should have been a simple evening of basketball and friendship. The story of how Ted Wire came to die alone in this isolated shelter, surrounded by everything he needed to survive but unable to save himself, begins hours earlier and 70 miles away in the small farming town of Yuba City. The 5 men who had become known as the Yuba County 5 shared a bond that went deeper than friendship. Ted Wire, 32, was a gentle giant who stood nearly 6 feet tall and weighed 200 pounds. His intellectual disability made him childlike in many ways, but his heart was enormous. He lived with his mother and stepfather, and his family described him as someone who would never hurt anyone and trusted everyone he met. Ted had served briefly in the army but received a medical discharge. He worked when he could find jobs, but his main joy in life came from basketball and spending time with his 4 best friends. Gary Mathias, 25, was the unofficial leader of the group, despite his own struggles with mental illness. He had been diagnosed with schizophrenia after developing drug problems while serving in the army in West Germany. But by 1978, Gary was considered a success story by his doctors. He took his medication regularly, worked in his stepfather's gardening business, and was described by his physicians as one of our sterling success cases. Gary was the only one of the 5 who seemed to understand that there was a world beyond their small circle, but he chose to stay loyal to his friends. Jackie Hewitt, 24, was the youngest of the group and perhaps the most dependent. His family said he was like a child in many ways, trusting and innocent. He had trouble with telephone conversations and would often have his brother answer calls for him. Despite his intellectual limitations, Jackie was known for his kindness and his loyalty to his friends. He lived with his parents and rarely went anywhere without at least one of the other 4 men. Jack Madruga, 30, was the practical one of the group. He had his driver's license and owned a 1969 Mercury Montego, which made him the designated driver for most of their adventures. Jack was an army veteran who had learned to be responsible, but he was also protective of his friends. His family said he was careful with his car and would never let anyone else drive it. Jack worked various jobs and lived with his parents, but he was known throughout their community as someone who looked out for others. Bill Sterling, 29, was the oldest of the group and in some ways the most capable. He had intellectual disabilities but was higher functioning than some of the others. Bill had once been taken by his father on a fishing trip to the mountains, but he hadn't enjoyed the experience and refused to go back. He preferred the familiar comforts of home and the predictable routines of town life. Like the others, Bill lived with his parents and rarely ventured far from the world he knew. The 5 men had formed their friendship through the Gateway Gators, a basketball team sponsored by a local program for people with disabilities. Basketball was more than a game to them. It was a shared passion that gave their lives structure and meaning. They practiced together, played together, and dreamed together about winning tournaments and earning recognition for their skills. They were scheduled to play in a Special Olympics tournament the next day, with the winners earning a free trip to Los Angeles. All 5 men had laid out their uniforms the night before and asked their parents to wake them up on time. On February 24th, 1978, the 5 friends decided to make the 50-mile drive north to Chico to watch the UC Davis basketball team play against Chico State. It was a cold night, with temperatures in the 30s and snow beginning to fall in the higher elevations. The men wore light jackets, suitable for the valley but not for mountain weather. They piled into Jack's Mercury Montego and drove through the darkness towards what they thought would be a simple evening of basketball. The game went well, with UC Davis winning, and the 5 men were in good spirits as they left the campus. They stopped at Bears Market in downtown Chico, arriving just before the 10 p.m. closing time. The clerk remembered them because she was annoyed that such a large group had come in so late, delaying her closing routine. They bought snacks, sodas, and cartons of milk, the kind of food that people purchase for a short trip home. But they never made it home. Somewhere in the darkness between Chico and Yuba City, something went wrong. The next morning, when the men failed to appear for their tournament, their families knew immediately that something was terribly wrong. These were not the kind of men who would miss an important game or worry their parents by staying out all night without permission. The search began immediately, with police from multiple counties combing the most direct routes between Chico and Yuba City. But the searchers found nothing along the expected path. It wasn't until February 28th that a forest ranger reported seeing Jack's Mercury Montego parked along a remote mountain road in the Plumas National Forest. The car was 70 miles from Chico, in the opposite direction from home, on a winding dirt road that led deep into the mountains. When investigators reached the abandoned car, they found a scene that made no sense. The Mercury was stuck in a snowbank, but not seriously. 5 healthy men should have been able to push it out easily. The engine started immediately when police hotwired it, and the gas tank was 1/4 full. The car keys were missing, but everything else suggested that the vehicle had been abandoned by choice, not necessity. Inside the car, investigators found the wrappers from the food the men had bought at Bears Market, along with programs from the basketball game and a neatly folded road map. But what puzzled them most was the condition of the car itself. Despite being driven up a rough mountain road with numerous rocks and potholes, the Mercury's undercarriage showed no damage, not even scratches on the low-hanging muffler. Either the driver had been extraordinarily careful, or someone very familiar with the road had been behind the wheel. The location of the car raised immediate questions. Why would 5 men from the valley, none of whom enjoyed cold weather or mountain hiking, drive up a treacherous mountain road on a winter night? Jack's parents said he disliked cold weather and had never been in the mountains. Bill's father had taken him to this area once for fishing, but Bill had hated the experience and refused to return. None of the men had any reason to be in this remote location. A severe snowstorm made searching difficult, and after 2 days the search was called off due to dangerous conditions. The 5 men seemed to have vanished completely, leaving behind only their abandoned car and a growing sense of dread among their families. Winter settled over the mountains, and the snow grew deeper, making any further search impossible until spring. But the mountains keep their secrets only so long. In June 1978, after the snow had melted, a group of motorcyclists rode up to a Forest Service trailer located about 20 miles from where the Mercury had been found. The trailer was part of a remote campground, accessible only by a rough dirt road. As the motorcyclists approached, they noticed that the front window had been broken. When they opened the door, they were overwhelmed by the stench of decay. Inside, wrapped in 8 sheets, was the body of Ted Wyer. The sight was heartbreaking and horrifying. Ted had lost nearly half his body weight, dropping from 200 pounds to just over 100. His beard had grown out, suggesting he had lived for months after the group's disappearance. His feet were badly frostbitten, almost gangrenous, and he was wearing only a velour shirt and lightweight pants. His shoes were nowhere to be found. The scene in the trailer was a study in tragic irony. Ted had died of starvation and hypothermia, but he was surrounded by everything he needed to survive. The trailer's fireplace was unused, despite an ample supply of matches and paperback books that could have served as kindling. Heavy forestry clothing hung nearby, clothes that would have kept him warm through the winter. A dozen sea ration cans had been opened and consumed, but a locker containing enough dehydrated food to feed all 5 men for a year had never been touched. Most puzzling of all, a butane tank sat in a nearby shed with a valve that, if opened, would have fed the trailer's heating system. Ted had lived for months in near-freezing temperatures when warmth was just a turn of a valve away. On the table beside the bed where he died were his personal effects, his wallet with cash still inside, a ring engraved with Ted, and a gold necklace. There was also a gold watch that his family said wasn't his, and a partially melted candle. The evidence suggested that Ted had not been alone in the trailer. Gary Mathias's tennis shoes were found inside, and the sea rations had been opened with a P38 can opener, a military tool that only Gary or Jack would have known how to use. The sheets covering Ted's body indicated that someone else had been there to care for him, as his frostbitten feet would have made it impossible for him to cover himself. Over the following days, searchers found the remains of the other 3 men along the road between the trailer and the abandoned car. Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling were discovered about 11 miles from the car, their bodies on opposite sides of the road. Both had died of hypothermia, and investigators believed they had stayed together until the end, with one dying and the other remaining beside him until he too succumbed to the cold. Jackie Hewitt's remains were found 2 miles from the trailer, scattered by scavenging animals. His backbone was discovered under a manzanita bush, with his skull found 300 feet away. He had also died of hypothermia, but investigators couldn't determine exactly when or how he had become separated from the others. Gary Mathias was never found. His shoes in the trailer suggested he had been there with Ted, but whether he had died in the mountains or somehow escaped remained unknown. Investigators distributed his photograph to mental health facilities throughout California, hoping someone might have seen him, but no trace of Gary was ever discovered. The deaths of the Yuba County 5 created more questions than answers. How had 5 men who disliked cold weather and mountain hiking ended up on a remote forest road? Why had they abandoned a working car that could have taken them to safety? How had they walked 20 miles through snowdrifts up to 6 feet deep? And most heartbreaking of all, why had Ted Wyer died of starvation and cold when he was surrounded by food and heating materials? The case took on an even more mysterious dimension when Joseph Schons came forward. Schons, a man from Sacramento, had been driving to his mountain cabin on the night of February 24th when his car became stuck in the snow about 150 feet from where the Mercury was later found. While trying to free his car, Schons began experiencing symptoms of a heart attack and retreated to his vehicle to rest. Around midnight, Schons saw headlights approaching from behind. A car parked near his, and he could make out several people around the vehicle, including what appeared to be a woman holding a baby. When he called out for help, the group fell silent and turned off their lights. Later, he saw flashlights that also went dark when he called out. Schons said he couldn't understand why anyone would ignore his pleas for help, especially on such a cold night. The witness account from Schons raised disturbing possibilities. Had the 5 men encountered other people on the mountain road? Had they been forced to abandon their car and walk into the wilderness? Or had they simply been too confused or frightened to help a stranger in distress? Another witness came forward from the small town of Brownsville, about 30 miles from where the car was found. A store clerk said that 4 men matching the description of the missing men had come to her store on February 25th, the day after their disappearance. The men were in a red pickup truck, and 2 of them used the payphone outside while the others bought food. The clerk said she immediately knew the men weren't from the area because of their big eyes and facial expressions. The witness account suggested that at least some of the men had survived the first night and were trying to find their way to safety. But if they had access to a pickup truck, why hadn't they returned home, and why had they ended up back in the mountains where they eventually died? Investigators developed a theory that the men had taken a wrong turn near Oroville while trying to visit friends in the small town of Forbestown. Gary Mathias was known to have friends there, and it was possible that the group had decided to make an impromptu visit on their way home. A wrong turn in the dark could have put them on the mountain road where their car was found. Once they realised they were lost, the men may have decided to follow the tracks left by a Forest Service snowcat that had cleared the road the day before. The tracks led toward the trailer, and the men might have believed they were following a path to safety. But the walk was much longer than they anticipated, and the snow was deeper than they realised. Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling probably died of hypothermia partway through the journey, unable to continue in the deep snow and freezing temperatures. Jackie Hewitt likely died soon after. Gary Mathias and Ted Wire somehow made it to the trailer, but they broke the window to get inside. But even in the relative shelter of the trailer, the cold was relentless, and both men were already suffering from frostbite and exposure. The tragedy of Ted Wire's death was that he lived for months in the trailer, but never figured out how to use the resources available to him. His intellectual disability meant he lacked the problem-solving skills to start a fire, heat the trailer, or properly use the available food supplies. He ate the sea rations, but couldn't understand how to open the locker containing more nutritious food. He knew he was cold, but couldn't figure out how to turn on the heating system. The case of the Yuba County 5 remains one of California's most puzzling mysteries. 5 men who should have been safe at home instead died in the wilderness under circumstances that have never been fully explained. The fact that their car was found in working condition, that Ted survived for months with adequate supplies, and that witnesses saw some of them alive the next day, all suggest that their deaths were not inevitable. The families of the 5 men have never stopped seeking answers. They erected a memorial and continued to push for investigations, hoping that someday someone would be able to explain what happened to their loved ones. The case has been featured in numerous documentaries and books, with investigators proposing various theories but never reaching a definitive conclusion. The Forest Service trailer where Ted Wire died has been removed, but hikers still visit the area where the tragedy occurred. The remote location serves as a reminder of how quickly things can go wrong in the wilderness, and how even the most basic survival needs can become impossible to meet when fear, cold, and confusion take hold. As new cases emerge and other people vanish into the unknown, one truth remains: somewhere out there, in forests and oceans, on mountains and city streets, the world continues its ancient work of creating mysteries that will outlive us all.